Some of y'all kept asking for more episodes of shorter stories again, and I said, hey, why not? So I tackled this huge stack of submissions I got, broke my elbow, and you're about to hear the most drastic variation of quality and subject matter you've heard on this show yet, with today's last story being the giant spider-human hybrid cherry on top. If you have a story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org so I can read it. Now, let's begin. A Strange Encounter in Glacier National Park. From VRoy89. I've always loved the backcountry, but there's a distinct difference between being alone in nature and feeling like you're being hunted. My wife and I used to live in Creston, British Columbia, right near the border. One summer, we decided on a whim to take a mostly unplanned 5-day trip down into Glacier National Park in Montana. We ended up taking the long, incredibly bumpy inside North Fork Road all the way out to Quartz Creek Campground, a very remote spot near the old Pole Bridge Ranger Station. The camp was laid out like a secluded cul-de-sac, with only about 7 or 8 campsites nestled right by the water. When we arrived, 3 of the spots were taken, but by the next night, everyone else had packed up. So it was just us. Total silence. We felt lucky, like we had our own private slice of the wilderness. On our 3rd day, we decided to hike down to Lower Quartz Lake. The trail started right from inside the North Fork area, where we were staying. The weather was perfect. Sunny and not too hot. Just a beautiful afternoon. Early into the hike, we passed a family of 5. We smiled and said hello, asking how the trail conditions were ahead. The dad told us they had only walked as far as the old historic Quarter Circle MC homestead, just up the path, and were turning back. We thanked them and kept walking. Everything was normal and fine, until we reached that old homestead. We explored the sunlit clearing, took some photos on our phones, then pushed past the old structures to continue down the main trail toward the lake. The moment we stepped back under the forest canopy, the entire atmosphere had changed. It was like the trees were actively closing in over us, choking out the sunlight. A heavy, creepy feeling settled over the woods, but neither of us wanted to ruin the mood. So we said nothing and kept walking. About 10 minutes down the path, the silence was shattered. Crack. It sounded like a massive, healthy tree was violently snapped in half right near us. But what made my blood run cold was what didn't follow. There was no crashing boom or a tearing of branches, not even leaves crunching. Just a single, violent snap. Before we could even process that, a sharp, clear whistle echoed through the timber. It sounded exactly like someone trying to get our attention. My wife and I stopped dead in our tracks, looking at each other like, what the hell was that? We tried to rationalize it. I even whistled back. Immediately, an answer came from the brush. I whistled a second time. Again, the exact same whistle echoed back at me, matching my tone perfectly. At that point, the atmosphere felt entirely wrong. I turned to my wife, and I told her to grab one of the phones out of my backpack so we could start recording that audio. Quickly, she reached in, pulled them out, and looked at the screens. "They're both dead," she whispered. My stomach dropped. We had just been using them to take photos at the homestead, just minutes earlier. They had been fully charged, too. The hair on the back of my neck stood completely on end. I could see the panic starting to form in my wife's eyes, and my survival instincts kicked in. I had to keep her calm. "The trail must turn and hug the river up ahead," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "That's where the noise is coming from. Let's just keep moving. We'll probably run into someone else soon." I knew darn well the trail went straight for a long ways before hitting the water, but I needed to keep her moving forward rather than running back toward whatever was mimicking me. We pushed on. The trail never turned. Eventually, we reached the river crossing. Someone had left a collection of sturdy walking sticks at the bank to help hikers balance against the current while crossing. We grabbed them, wading through the cold water and climbing up the opposite bank. As we stepped onto dry land, I instinctively looked back across the river. My heart stopped. Through a break in the thick brush, I swear I saw two pairs of unblinking eyes staring directly at us from the shadows. A second later, they simply vanished into the undergrowth. I didn't say a word to my wife. I was already questioning my own sanity. We made it to the lake, had a quick skinny dip, and ate some lunch. But the joy of the trip was gone. We just wanted to get back to safety. When we arrived back at the river crossing, the dread returned tenfold. The walking sticks we had used, the ones that had been left at the bank for the hikers, were completely gone. Someone or something had taken them while we were at the lake. My wife and I looked at each other. We didn't say it out loud, but our expression said everything. We are being watched, possibly even followed. The oppressive, heavy feeling of being hunted followed us every single step of the way back. It felt like something was walking parallel to us, just beyond the tree line. But the moment our boots stepped out of the trees, back into the sunlit clearing of the old homestead, that weight instantly lifted. The air felt light again. The dread vanished. Desperate for a taste of normalcy, we drove out of the park boundaries that evening to the tiny off-grid community of Polebridge. We stopped at the Northern Lights Saloon, had a great dinner, and a few strong drinks to calm the nerves, before heading back to our isolated campsite for the night. As we sat by the fire under the dark Montana sky at Quartz Creek, that feeling of being watched came back. But strangely, the malice was gone from it. It didn't feel threatening anymore. It just felt like whatever lived in those deep, forgotten woods was keeping tabs on us, making sure we knew well we were just visitors in its home. I don't know what snapped that tree, what drained our phones, or what copied my voice. But after spending years in the outdoors, I know one thing for certain. That was no human. Shapeshifter in Florida. From Noble Farnsworth. This account happened on December 14th and 15th of 2024 in a small town on the Space Coast of Florida called Titusville. Me and two of my older brothers frequented a hiking trail at Fox Lake Park. It's a beautiful little gym in Titusville. It has a playground, lake, and hiking trails. My brothers and I have hiked those trails our whole lives and fell in love with that park. I had just finished my school for the rest of the year, and one of my brothers, In, asked me if I wanted to go on a hike that afternoon to celebrate. I happily obliged, and I went with him. We hiked for about 2 hours and decided then to head back to the trailhead because the sun was starting to set. It was an ending to a perfect day, or it nearly was. As we were hiking back, all the woodland wildlife just vanished. And this was sudden. It was no slow fade. No more robins chirping or crickets. Not even the occasional wild hog grunting. Just silence. Me and In, now thoroughly spooked, decided to pick up our pace when a noise broke that silence. It was an odd sound, but I'll do my best to explain. It was like someone was tuning an analog radio with voices in the background. The voices weren't saying anything specific. It just sounded like they were trying to say something. In looked at me with an expression of fear and told me we had to leave right now. We ran back to the car and drove away. The following day, In and my other brother, S, decided to go back to investigate. I wasn't able to join them on this hike. I had planned to propose to my then girlfriend that very day, and if you're wondering, she did say yes. Anyway, as they entered the woods, they were hit with an overwhelming feeling of being watched. They tried to pay no attention to it, pressing onward. After some time, they noticed what looked to be a man watching them from behind, farther down the trail. According to their description, the man was at least 6 to 7 feet tall, and he didn't have any clothes on that they could tell. Being the blockheads they were, S and N decided to approach this man. As they walked towards him, the man went back into the woods without leaving a trace. Feeling somewhat disappointed with no real results coming from their investigation, S and N turned around and began to head back to the head of the trail. They'd only taken a couple of steps when voices began to come from the woods. The voices were coming from seemingly everywhere. S and N were frantic at this point. They searched for the source of the voices, but couldn't find anything. But then they looked behind them. Standing there was a perfect copy of N himself. Everything was the same, from the shorts and shirt he was wearing, even the freaking hat. S and N finally had enough and began to run back. As they were running, they heard crunching leaves behind them. They stopped for only a moment to check their surroundings when a large gust of wind came out of the bushes to their right, followed by the sound of something running away at an ungodly speed. Fortunately, they made it back to their car without further incident. Ever since those experiences, my brothers and I don't go hiking there as often as we used to. I'm not sure if I want to go back at all, to be honest. All I know is that there are things in this world that we can't understand. Maybe it's for the best it stays that way. The mask that saved my life. From NoodleFox113. I'm a weird kid, always have been. I used to hate the fact that I was different, but I ended up embracing it in middle school, when I actually made some friends. I started making masks when I was 12, animal-themed ones, like cats and dogs. Then I made my first complex mask. This one was a deer skull. I made it entirely out of cardboard. It had long antlers and I'd painted black mesh over the eyes, so they looked like dark holes where the eyes should have been. My brothers made fun of me for it, which was reasonable considering how odd it was to see me walking around my backyard in the dark with that mask on my head. But I'd grown attached to it. I brought it multiple times when my dad and brothers went golf ball hunting on dark nights. My mother actually told me it was terrifying after I made it. I was waiting for a time I could scare some people with it, and that time finally came. My parents told us we would be going on a camping trip in the Yellowstone Pass that you have to drive through to get to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We packed, and of course I brought my mask, as well as a cardboard tail that was linked with bones that I'd been working on. Cardboard bones. Then me and my 2 younger brothers were told that our 4 older siblings would be coming along with us. We waited for them to come to our house before we all drove to our camping spot. We left around noon. The first half of the drive was just open fields. We somehow managed to fit all 9 of us into our large van, along with all of our camping gear in the back. The drive to the pass was about 3 hours, and our van was loud with talking and arguing, even though all my older siblings and I had phones that could keep us occupied. I had turned on my JBL headphones, listening to some scary Deep Woods compilations, staring out the window at the vast wheat fields that spanned out every direction. The closer we got to the pass and our turning point to our campsite, the more my anticipation rose. But something else rose along with it. Fear. Like something was there, watching. I've grown to read these feelings. I believe myself to be a sort of weaker psychic, one who doesn't get visions necessarily, but feelings of something bound to happen. I calmed myself down with deep breaths and stared out the window as we entered the pass. Tall woods of lodgepole pines and aspens loomed all around us as we drove through the pass. We were heading through for about half an hour before my dad turned down a paved trail with a sign that was labeled with campgrounds. We drove down the steep trail into the base of the pass. We packed out of our van in this clearing that was surrounded by lodgepole pines. There was a creek that flowed close to our campsite, which we pitched our tent by, for some natural white noise, as my mom said. My parents and 2 younger brothers were sleeping in their tent, so were my 3 older sisters. My older brother and I each had our own tents, though his was farther away from the rest of our tents, because that's how he was. He liked being as far away as he could without getting lost, though he swore he never did get lost, which was a lie because I've seen him get lost in his own neighborhood before. By the time we were finished unpacking, it was about 5:30 p.m., but the sun didn't set until 9, so our parents let us roam around the campsite to explore a bit. My dad and brothers went off to find a geocache spot that was supposedly in our area, and my sisters just stayed in their tent and talked. I was never close to my sisters, so I went off alone into the woods, following the creek upriver. After about 15 minutes of walking, I came across this large fallen tree, which had a hole in the bark, showing me that the tree was hollowed out like a cave. I took a step closer to that tree, feeling a cold breeze come out of the trunk. That's when I heard something. I was wearing my mask at the time, so my vision was limited, but I swear I heard breathing, deep but shallow at the same time, and raspy. Another breeze slapped me in the face, but this time it smelled of rotting meat. I tried not to gag, so I stepped out of the tree and coughed. After I was done coughing, I heard the cowbell that my mom would ring to tell us to come home whenever we didn't have any cell service. I walked back to the camp, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept looking behind me, and there would be nothing. So I chalked it up to being scared from those scary stories compilations I was listening to on the way here. After we finished dinner, we were allowed to go back to exploring, but we had to come back before dark. My internal clock is pretty good, so I didn't set an alarm on my phone to start walking back. Plus, I could just look up at the sky and see if it was getting close to dark. I headed back to that fallen tree with a flashlight this time, so I could take a look inside. Once I got there, that smell was gone, and so was the feeling of being watched. I flicked on the flashlight and peered into the log. It was large inside that tree, warm too. It would be a perfect shelter for a bear or some other creature. With that thought, I then realized it probably wasn't the best idea to be inside the log, if it was in fact a den for some animal. But being the curious kid I was, I decided to look into the other side of the tree, which I now deeply regret. I turned around in the tree and shone my light on the other side of it. What I saw appeared to be bones. I took my mask off to get a closer look, and sure enough, this side of the tree was filled with bones. The thing that freaked me out the most was that they were all skulls. Some from cattle, others from deer and elk. I swear I even saw a moose skull, which was old and polished looking. I ran from the tree as fast as I could, but I tripped over a root, and I hit my head. I blacked out. I awoke to complete darkness, not knowing where I was. I remembered I was running from the tree cave, but didn't know where exactly I might be, where the camp was, or even where the tree was now. I'd never been in these woods in the dark, so I didn't know my way back. I felt a cut on my forehead from where I hit it when I passed out, and my pants were ripped up and knees were bleeding. I stood and grabbed onto the closest tree I could. I was dizzy after waking up. I was going through all my survival skills I'd memorized about finding a way back in the dark, but I couldn't remember much. I sat on a log trying to remember anything that might help me get back to camp, when I heard it. Something big coming towards me through the trees. It sounded bigger than anything I'd ever heard move through undergrowth before. For some reason, I had an instinctual feeling to put the mask on and get and stay low to the ground. At this point, I was listening to any feeling I got, so I proceeded to put on my mask and my hood. I was wearing all black, so I could camouflage myself well in the dark, but the mask was bone white and stood out like a sore thumb in the darkness. The thing in the woods moved closer to me. Eventually, I could see it. It was tall, about 10 feet, with white skin and black patchy fur. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and I swear I could see ribs, along with every bone in its body through its skin. And its head was a deer skull. My body was shaking. I was trying to remain as small-looking as possible. I could see that it was looking at me, but something deep inside me told me it didn't want to kill me. I'm about 5'10" and have long limbs myself, so when the little voice in the back of my mind told me to stand up, I did, and the creature did nothing. It tilted its head and reached a long, bony hand out at me. I reached back at the thing, and it brushed its long finger against my glove, which had long paper claw fingers painted white and black to look more natural. It grunted at me, but then it nodded its head, then turned and walked away. I stood there in shock, trying to figure out what the heck just happened. It turned its head without turning its body and looked off into the distance behind me, then walked into the darkness. It disappeared into the shadowy woods as I stood there frozen. Eventually, I walked into the direction of my camp. When I got back, my parents informed me that I was lost for 4 hours and they could not find me anywhere. I told them that I was at the large fallen down hollow tree about 10 minutes upstream from the creek. They decided it was probably best to leave, so we packed up our camp and left. Everyone was mad at me for ruining the camping trip, but I was still in too much shock at what I encountered. I kept wondering, did that creature think I was one of its kind? If you're the weird kid in your family, embrace it. You never know when it might save your life. The paranormal in my home. From Wholesome Deer. My whole life I've been living in the country. My name is Celine and I live in Ontario, Canada with my family of 5. Everyone in this house believes in the paranormal to some extent, and we all have experienced some sort of supernatural goings-on. I'm here to tell you a few of the times my family and I have witnessed some of these things. When I was 3, my mom, Charlotte, and my stepdad, Mateo, were talking on my back porch when they started to hear crashing sounds in the old field where the old owner of the house kept his horses. There was a shed there covered in a black tarp. My old dog, who was a German shepherd named Tucker, began to bark over at the shed. Charlotte tried to keep Tucker back with her and my stepdad, but he slipped out of his collar and ran quickly towards the shed. When he got into it, there was a horrific sound, like a mix of a roar and a scream, and after a few moments, we saw this huge black shape run out of the tarped shed, and Tucker came proudly trotting back, unharmed, thankfully. There were other instances where we've heard it. My mom can't think of anything that could have sounded like what she and Mateo had heard that night, though. My friend Areki and I went down the road one day with my brother Leo, who was on his bike. We turned right onto a road that I walk down almost every day. As we walked, we noticed an outhouse that had not been there the day before, so we decided to check it out. Why not? Areki and I were teenagers. Leo was 10. We were curious kids. We walked up the slight incline up to the outhouse. When we got there, we heard what sounded like a deer, sort of calling, and it kept going until we realized it sounded hurt or dying. But something in my head was telling me that we should not go any further. We should not go investigate to see if it's okay. I've heard some scary, foresty stories before. I knew not to follow strange voices or sounds into the woods, so we left right away. On another occasion, we went somewhere where allegedly a spiritual ritual of sorts had taken place. It was sort of a local legend. I pulled up my phone there and turned on a spirit talker app to see if we could get anyone on there or have a conversation with the spirit. After 20 minutes of nothing, we left. We actually decided to go back to that strange outhouse, which was still there. Lo and behold, when we arrived, there were more deer sounds. Leo decided to stay down at the bottom of the slope, saying he didn't want a ghost to possess his bike. while Areki and I were listening to these strange deer sounds, realizing it was constant. We listened to it for a good 15 minutes. It moved during that time all around us, coming closer, then moving away, then doing it again. It shifted a few times too. There were times it sounded like a woman crying or calling for help. Then there were the sounds of thudding and crashing. At one point we heard a snap so close to us, it made Leo scream. We decided then we should leave. We got home no problem, but we are planning to go back to see if we can still hear it. Maybe we can record it. By the way, I think we have a mimic in our house. We often hear it copying my little sister Kate. She has a different dad than Leo and I, so she goes on visits every month from the 1st to the 8th, and every second weekend. Charlotte can often hear Kate calling for her, yelling "Mom," crying, or laughing. Charlotte has also heard Mateo or Leo calling out for her. Leo has heard Charlotte calling for him, and Leo being Leo, he always answers back to the strange voice. He often hears us calling for him, but he always answers with a yes or coming. He's also heard our Nana at the same time as I did. It sounded like a loud and automated hi, but like our Nana still, but a robotic version of her. I had to tell him to stop answering the voices, because whatever it was feeding off of confusion and probably liked the replies we were giving it. That's probably why it was still there. There's another short instance we had. One night, around 1 a.m., Charlotte was teaching Leo and I how to play poker with my collection of pennies. There was a bad thunderstorm going on. We had lots of dogs and 2 cats. Some other family members had been living in our yard for a few months, and one of their dogs had passed away in that yard. That night, Charlotte had felt a small and cold pressure on her side, where our small dog named Grapes had always leaned against her. She said his name, and she felt the cold air shift. She said a few other names, but it never shifted the same way with those. She then said Grapes' name again, and it shifted once more. Some of our other animals came to visit, too. Leo had both of the cats with him, Gilligan and Blizzard. Charlotte had 2 of our dogs, Grapes and Titus, and I had our cousin's dog, Karma, who had passed away in our field from a yeast infection because our cousins never took proper care of her. To our cousins, dogs equal money, so Karma didn't mean anything to them. But I loved Karma. She was such a sweet dog. It reminded me of my dog Archer. But yeah, that night broke all of our hearts. These are just a few of my family's paranormal stories. A lot of weird things happen to certain families, and we're one of those families, I guess. It has hunted me for a decade. From Wrecking Hazard 07. This is a true story. It happened around 10 years ago, when I was about 7 or 8. Some background information before we start. This might get somewhat confusing without a good image in your head. I'm an Australian boy. I grew up with my house backing onto the Australian bushland. I wouldn't trade it for the world. I hate big cities, and my small suburban town is what I like. However, this story doesn't take place there. At least, not yet. When I was around 7 or 8, my parents bought a plot of land a few hours north of our house. This small town, if you could call it that, was much more secluded than where I live. It has a boat ramp, a community hall, a playground, and a public toilet. Aside from houses, that's all that's there. No shops or cafes, just a small village surrounded by bushland and a river. The highway isn't far from it, only about a kilometer, as that's the only way in and the only way out. But that doesn't matter for now. The block of land was empty when we first got there, except for a water tank and an old, decrepit caravan. There was also a septic tank, as there was no sewage pipes or plants nearby. We had our own caravan we stayed in before we built the garage and house, but this was when the weird things began. Our first night there, I couldn't sleep. I heard heavy sounds outside, and I just thought it was a kangaroo. I saw some huge ones that day, and they're quite loud when they jump. so I just brushed it off and eventually fell asleep. When we woke up, though, we found a dead mouse at our door. An odd occurrence, to be sure, but there were goannas, snakes, and foxes, plus baits for the foxes, as they're pests and kill local wildlife. So it wasn't surprising to see this, though this mouse did not have any telltale signs of what killed it. Though it did look squished, like something had grabbed it and squeezed it like a sponge, then let it go. Fast forward about a year later. I had my friend up with us along with her dad. She'll remain nameless for the sake of privacy. She's older than me by a few months, but she's known me since I was born. My dad and her dad were friends years before us. We were having a great time going out on the water on the boat, water skiing, wakeboarding. I was the best at kneeboarding personally, and I still am, despite having knee problems now. Anyway, after we came home, we sat around for a little while, but me and my friend soon got bored. The sun was going down over the trees, but there was still some orange light out there, and we decided to go to the playground up the road, only a few hundred meters up the road, that is. The way this was set up was, if you were looking down the street, my house and the park we're on, you'd have your back to the road that leads out of the town if you took a right. Looking toward my house, try to imagine a long, horizontal rectangle. On the left line is the playground. Just next to that is the community hall, going towards the right side of the rectangle. After that is the public toilet, all within about 20 meters of each other, but having gaps in between. On the top line of the rectangle, we have bushland for hundreds of kilometers on the right. Just next to the park, to about halfway up the rectangle, is water. When you make it halfway along the rectangle, there's another street. All the way at the end of the rectangle and the street, as it was a dead end, is my house. So me and my friend are at the park. My back is to the bush, and I'm on the swings. My friend was talking to me, facing towards me, so looking towards the bush. She asks me, "Hey, was that tree there before?" I was confused and looked behind me, still swinging. The light was dimming, the trees becoming blackened with shadow, but this one tree looked rather off. It was shorter than the others, around 8 feet tall, and it did not have any leaves. It appeared to have only 2 branches that sank downwards like arms, and on the top of the trunk was something that looked almost like a head. Now, I was not a fearless child, trust me. I was diagnosed with anxiety at only age 6, but I'm over that now. This thing didn't scare me, however. I brushed it off as an old tree with its branches snapped, leaves fallen because it's dead, and on top was one of those termite mounds, which are fairly common here. But that assumption was thrown out the window when we both heard this terrible screech. The only way to describe it was metallic, as if whatever was screeching at us had vocal cords of metal sheets, and someone was scratching them with a knife at the same time. And yet it still sounded animalistic, like a living thing was making the sound. At this point, it's so dark, the 3 street lamps on the street come on, and one of them was conveniently in front of the community hall and provided just enough light to see what was there. And what we saw was downright horrifying. Its body was skinny. You could see its ribs through its skin, which was jet black and looked like it was made of oil. It was darker than the shadows of the now set sun. Then it looked at us. One eye opened, orange, like the sunset, and with a void-like black pupil in the center. The other eye opened, white as snow, but no pupil. Both eyes glowed like beacons in the almost nighttime darkness. Then it smiled. That smile was so haunting. It had a huge mouth, too big for its head. Its mouth just kept stretching and stretching until it was grinning literally ear to ear, if it had ears, that is. Its teeth, perfectly white and perfectly sharp, each tooth fit perfectly between the other, glowing with the glow of its own eyes. Then it moved. the same heavy footsteps I heard on our first ever time sleeping there. I leapt off the swing, landing on the sand like Spider-Man, and grabbing my friend's hand, pulling her behind the hall and in front of the water, separating us from the bush. Then I stopped and listened. I don't know why, but I did. I heard it. It was waiting for us on the other side of the community hall, waiting for us to come out, to go running past. We doubled back and went around the front of the hall and along the road. I let go of my friend and ran as fast as I could. At the time, I played football and was on the wing, so I was very fast. I looked behind to see my friend, who was not anywhere near as fast as me. She was screaming while running, and this thing was now following us. I swear the only reason it didn't catch us that night was because it was running into trees. I slowed down and grabbed her hand, and I pulled her the rest of the way. We got back to the house, and I shut the gate behind me, as if that was going to do anything. I looked back, trying to calm myself. I saw it just in time to see the glow of its eyes fading into the bush. We did not tell our parents. We thought they wouldn't believe us, or for some reason we might get in trouble. For what, I didn't know, but that's the way kids think. A few months after this, I was back in the suburb I lived in, waiting in the car after football training. The field we trained at was surrounded by bush. I didn't have a phone or an iPad like these kids nowadays, so I just looked out the window while my dad was talking to the coach. I'd had this altercation with another kid in the team who had been bullying me. Let's just say he stopped after that night, thanks to some persuasion from my boot. Anyway, I looked out the window. In the distance, I saw two glowing colors, one orange and one white. I was absolutely terrified. This thing, it had followed me all the way to my home, hundreds of kilometers away. You have no idea how scared I was, out of my mind, and as soon as Dad got in the car, I begged him in tears to leave. He thought I was just doing something to not get in much trouble with the coach, but we left nonetheless. About a year went by after this. I was walking my dog around the block, and funnily enough, just down the road from my actual house is also a playground, only about 75 meters down the road. I was walking past it in broad daylight toward my house, and I heard in the bush surrounding it someone call my name. I have a common first name, and people around here know me pretty well. The thing is, it also said my last name. My last name isn't common at all. There is an American pop singer with the same last name, but I won't say who, and obviously we're not related. So I hear my full name coming from the bush, from a voice I did not recognize. My dog, who is usually a friendly little gremlin who would try to make friends with a German shepherd who would bite him in half, was scared to death. He was hiding behind me. His tail, which was always up and wagging on a walk, was now tucked between his legs. Usually, if something was trying to attack me or him, he'd get small dog syndrome and try to attack it back. But this was different. This was the only time I've seen him physically hide from something. I took off running, so did the dog. We ran all the way home. I took him inside, locked the doors, and closed the blinds, and I stayed in my room with the dog until my parents got home a few hours later. I grew to accept that whatever this thing was, it was not going to leave me alone. While my anxiety was getting better, my paranoia spiked. I'd see those glowing lights, but soon they would be accompanied by an ominous purple glow. About 5 years after my first encounter with it at the park, I was back up north with one of the local kids. I was telling him about this thing and what it did as we were walking down that very same road at night. He lived on the street halfway down the rectangle, and I was walking him home. I was a year and a half older and thought I was responsible. I had my black belt, after all. We got to the corner of the street, and we saw in the bush a faint purple glow. I knew what it was right away. That creature was back. I then saw the glowing eyes through the trees, and I froze. I also have anger management problems, as seen earlier by the football bully. When my body goes into fight or flight mode, it almost always chooses fight. But this time it chose freeze. I stood there in the middle of the road staring at the glowing eyes that I knew were its eyes. It was much taller now. It had been about 8 feet tall, but now was approaching 15 feet. When it got closer to the tree line, about 50 meters out, I heard it screech. I booked it after that. Me and the local kid sprinted down the road to his house. He ran inside, and I went all the way home, going the other way through the bush. I'd come out at the right side of the rectangle, pretty much at my house, and I didn't see the creature when I got back in. It's been 5 years since then. My paranoia has stayed the same, and some of my friends say I might be schizophrenic when I tell them this story. But it's real. It happened to real people, not just to me. 2 different people other than me can recall this thing. Now I'm an adult, and I still live at home, as the housing market is way too expensive. I still lock all the doors and windows, and I close every door in the house aside from my room when I'm home alone. And as soon as the sun sets, I close all the blinds in the house, and I bring the dog inside for a little extra protection and for company. Still, I occasionally see the glowing eyes, and I have some paranoid episodes when I'm at work, since I start work when it's pitch black at 5 a.m. But I haven't been attacked since that incident about 5 years ago. Believe me or not, I know what I saw. I know it chased me, and I know it's still following me to this day. Maybe I should confront it. That could be a stupid idea. Maybe it just wants a friend. It's only ever come after me when I've been with people or my dog, after all. Otherwise, it seems to wait, watch, observing. If you ever see glowing lights in the Australian bush, go the other way. Everything wants to kill you here anyway, and you don't want to become a statistic for something that, quote-unquote, doesn't exist. Beneath the White Picket Fence. From Bryant. Look, if you looked up my hometown on a map, you'd think it was paradise. I lived there when I was about 13, and the place was wealthy, clean, and completely quiet. Nothing bad ever happened there. It was just constant sunshine and, I'm not even joking, literal rainbows. Because of how the valley was shaped, we got these massive, bright rainbows multiple times a week. It was almost stupid how perfect it looked on the surface. But there was something seriously off about the layout of the place. It was a decent-sized town, but we didn't have a public bus system. At all. Instead, the whole place was built on top of this massive web of underground concrete tunnels. The local rumor was that they were dug out back during the Civil War, so troops could move around without being seen. For a kid, having a secret underground highway system was the coolest thing imaginable. The walls were thick, cold concrete, and they were the absolute fastest way to get across town. Conveniently for me, there was a tunnel entrance right behind my house, but there was one massive weird rule about them. They were completely off limits from 11 o'clock at night until 4 in the morning. Every single night, these heavy industrial metal doors would slide shut, locking everyone out. Some older kids tried to sneak in past curfew once, but got caught by the cops. They straight up vanished into a juvenile cell for 3 days. No one's parents would talk about it afterward, which obviously just made the rest of us more obsessed. I have to admit, I tried to sneak a peek once when I was running late getting home. I stood right outside the heavy door after it clicked shut, pressing my ear against the cold metal to see if I could hear whatever the town was trying to hide. For a minute, it was just dead air. But then I heard it, a low rhythmic thumping sound. It didn't sound like machinery. It sounded exactly like someone walking down there, but on heavy, bare feet. That wasn't the only bizarre rule we lived by. Most kids in the town had a strict curfew to be inside the second the streetlights flickered on. I didn't think twice about it back then, because my parents genuinely didn't care what I did. They weren't mean or abusive, they were just totally checked out. Their entire philosophy on parenting was basically just don't get hurt, so that we don't have to deal with it. That was it. Because I had zero supervision, I decided to pull off a stunt one night. The streetlights always came on about 2 hours before the tunnel doors actually closed, which gave me a decent window of time to set things up. I bought a tiny, cheap digital camera and grabbed a wad of sticky tack from my desk. I snuck down to the entrance, wedging the camera into a tiny gap right above the doorframe where the automated slider moved, and I aimed it down into the dark. I hit record and ran like heck back to my house. The next morning, I snuck back down and grabbed the camera. What I saw on that screen was completely gut-wrenching. I don't even know how to describe it properly without sounding insane. It was a spider, but not like a daddy longlegs or something you'd find in your basement. This thing was a tank. It was easily 7 feet tall, bloated, and covered in thick, coarse hair. And the face didn't have a bunch of creepy little spider eyes. It only had 2. Just 2 huge pitch-black hollow eyes that looked eerily human. It was completely messed up, but looking at the footage, I felt this bizarre, deep pull towards it. It sounds crazy, but I felt drawn to it. That dark curiosity completely took over, and I decided I needed to see this thing with my own eyes. A few nights later, I slipped inside the tunnel right before 11 o'clock. I found a spot in the deep corners of the main chamber, hiding behind a big stack of old maintenance boxes. I squeezed myself into the gap, and I waited. My heart was practically in my throat when the automated system kicked in. The heavy metal doors slid shut with a loud echoing slam, and the locks engaged. I was officially trapped in the dark. A few minutes went by, then I heard the familiar heavy thumping sound coming from the eastern corridor. That was the exact route I'd seen on my camera. Fear and this weird hypnotic gravity kept me glued to the floor. I kept telling myself I was ready for this. I wanted to meet it. Then, the creature actually rounded the corner. Seeing it on a tiny camera screen did not prepare me for the real thing. The smell hit me first. It smelled like rotting meat and wet dirt. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, as its hairy legs scraped against the concrete walls. The second those 2 dark, beady eyes locked right onto the boxes I was hiding behind, all that stupid curiosity vanished. Survival instinct finally knocked some sense into me. I realized I was nothing more than bait or prey. I let out a scream, bolting out from behind the boxes and running for my life toward the big metal door. I was panicking because I knew it was supposed to be locked from 11 to 4, but as I threw myself toward it, I noticed something the town officials must have messed up, or maybe they did it on purpose. The heavy security bolts were actually on the outside of the door, not the inside. The system wasn't built to lock people out. It was built to keep something in. I slammed my body against the emergency push bar. The magnetic locks groaned, lost their grip, and the door popped open just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't look back once. I sprinted across the yard, scrambling up through my bedroom window, and I buried myself under my bedsheets, shaking until the sun came up. Whatever I saw that night was not a one-time thing. I found out later there was a whole network of these creatures, and the local government was actively covering it up to keep the town looking perfect. Apparently, they were keeping them contained under the streets while something even worse was breeding out in the deep woods past the town borders. The next morning, the town looked exactly like it always did. A postcard, drenched in sunshine. A massive, perfect rainbow arched over the valley, its colors reflecting off the pristine, white picket fences of my neighborhood. It made me want to vomit. I stood at my bedroom window, fingers trembling against the glass. My neighbor across the street meticulously trimming his hedges. He smiled and waved to a passing jogger and checked his watch. Everything was orderly, everything calm, but I knew what was breathing right under his sneakers. I looked down at my palms. They were stained with black grease from the tunnel door's emergency push bar and scraped raw from my mad scramble through my bedroom window. My chest still ached from the terror, but underneath the residual adrenaline, that bizarre magnetic pull I'd felt while looking at the camera footage was already creeping back. It was like a low-frequency hum vibrating in my teeth. My survival instinct had saved me last night, but daylight brought a reckless, burning need to understand what the hell was actually happening to my hometown. My parents were sitting at the kitchen island when I finally crept downstairs. My dad was scrolling through his tablet and my mom was sipping a green smoothie. They didn't look up. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse. "Did you guys hear anything weird last night? Like by the tunnel entrance?" "Make sure you lock the back door if you go out today, sweetie," my mom said, her eyes glued to some recipe on her phone. "Mom, seriously, I think there's something wrong with the security system down there. The door popped open." Dad sighed, tapping at his screen. "Just don't get hurt, kiddo. We don't want another trip to the ER like last summer. Go play outside, it's beautiful out." It was the same wall of total apathy. They weren't mean or abusive. They were just totally checked out, just as I told you before. Looking at them now, it seemed deliberate, a practiced blindness that everyone in this valley seemed to share. I realized I couldn't talk to any adults. If I showed them the footage I got, they'd probably just think I edited it, or they would tell me to go watch TV. I needed to find out what else the town was hiding. According to an old zoning map I got from the town library, the concrete tunnels didn't just loop under the suburbs. The eastern corridors, the exact path the 7-foot creature had walked, stretched straight out past the residential zones, terminating right at the edge of the forest. My own camera footage had proven the underground grid was a containment system, a massive cage under the asphalt. But my mind kept looping back to the rumor I'd uncovered. They were keeping them contained under the streets, while something even worse was out in the deep woods. The forest was dense, basically an overgrown patch of ancient timber that the town council had strictly designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary. There were no hiking trails, no campgrounds, and no trespassing. The dark curiosity that had dragged me into the tunnels now pulled my eyes toward the tree line. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I packed a backpack with a heavy-duty flashlight, my digital camera, and a pocket knife. I grabbed my bike and pedaled toward the eastern edge of town. The bright, perpetual sunshine of the valley began to fracture as I approached the border, all thanks to the encroaching canopy of the forest. I ditched my bike in a thick patch of ferns and crossed the perimeter fence. The moment my boots hit the forest floor, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew rapidly colder, dropping at least 10 degrees. The cheerful chirp of birds and the drone of lawnmowers died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. The trees here were twisted, bark blackened and peeling, and a thick, low-hanging mist crawled over the damp earth. I pushed deeper into the woods, following the path of a dried creek bed that aligned with the eastern tunnel trajectory. The smell hit me then, the same smell from the tunnel, but much denser. It was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. After 40 minutes of walking, the trees began to thin, opening into a big, unnatural clearing. In the center of the clearing was this huge crater, as if something massive had crashed into the earth a long time ago. Or maybe it was a sinkhole. The edges of the pit were lined with shattered concrete pillars and rusted rebar. I crept forward on my stomach, and I peered carefully over the lip of the crater. The bottom of the pit was shrouded in a thick yellowish fog, but as the wind shifted, the mist cleared just enough to reveal a sight that froze the air in my lungs. Spread across the crater floor were thousands of translucent pulsing sacs. They were the size of trash bags, glowing with a faint, sickly light. Inside each sack, I could see the distinct, writhing silhouettes of the 7-foot tank spiders, but smaller. They weren't just living here. They were being grown here. But the spiders weren't the source of the dread pressing down on my chest. They were all facing inward, completely motionless, arranged in concentric circles like worshippers around an altar. In the absolute center of the pit sat a structure that made the tank spiders look like common house pets. It looked like a mountain of calcified bone and hardened black resin, rising 30 feet into the air. Like a hive. Suddenly the ground shook beneath me. A low, bassy, heavy vibration rattled my teeth. The calcified structure began to shift, and something began to crawl out of the dark interior. I reached for my camera, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it into the pit. I raised the lens, zooming in through the yellow fog. If the creature in the tunnel was a spider, this thing was a god. It rose on 8 elongated, spindly legs that were easily 40 feet long, jointed like rusted iron cranes. Its body wasn't bloated and hairy, but armored in a sleek black shell. Rising from the center of the arachnid lower body was a sickeningly human shape. It had a long, pale, multi-jointed spine that curved upward, terminating in a massive elongated skull. It had no skin, just pale, translucent muscle fibers stretching over bone. And where its face should have been, there were no spider eyes at all, but 2 perfectly human eyes, the size of beach balls, milky white, and weeping a thick black fluid that pulled onto the crater floor. The Queen. Its jaw began to unhinge in a way that no living thing should be able to do. But instead of screaming or roaring, I instead began to feel a high-pitched, agonizing frequency in my brain. My nose began to bleed. I gasped, clasping my hands over my ears. I threw myself backward, scrambling to my feet, sprinting through the dark woods. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, leaping over fallen logs, lungs burning, and tears of pure terror blurring my vision. Eventually, I burst through the thick brush, tumbling over the perimeter fence, and I landed hard in the ditch where I'd left my bike. I scrambled up, grabbing the handlebars, and I threw myself onto the seat. I pedaled like a madman, breaking out of the tree line and back into the bright, artificial safety of the valley's golden sunshine. I didn't dare look back until I reached my driveway. I slammed the front door shut, locking all 3 deadbolts, and slid down against the wood, gasping for air, wiping the blood from my nose onto my sleeve. Through the window, I could see the neighborhood bathed in that sickeningly perfect light, and the woods looked completely normal, despite what was beyond them. My mom walked out of the kitchen holding a laundry basket. She looked at me, completely unbothered by my gasping breaths, my torn clothes, or the blood smeared across my face. "Oh good, you're home. Dinner will be ready at 6. Don't forget to wash your hands. And drink some water, honey, you look a little flushed." I never went back in those woods, never went near the tunnels anymore. As soon as I could, I moved far, far away, and I never came back. The town is still there. I have no idea how my parents are because I don't talk to them. But I wonder if the sun still shines there, or if the worst has yet happened. The Transfer. From Tommy Lee. From 2016 to 2019, I worked at a media transfer shop in Tulsa. We digitized people's old home movies. VHS, Super 8, Mini DV, you name it. Mostly it was birthday parties and bad camcorder zooms. It feels like after the first month you just sort of tune out what you're actually seeing, focusing on monitoring levels. In March of 2018, a woman dropped off a box of tapes from her late father's house. Standard estate job. 11 tapes, all labeled in marker. However, the 12th tape was not marked. And when I watched it, it was 40 minutes of hallway. Not footage of a hallway, but a camera set on something stable, pointing down a residential hallway at night. with the hall light on. There were 3 closed doors. Nothing happened for 40 minutes. I scrubbed through it twice looking for the reason it even existed. At 33 minutes and 40 seconds, the audio does pick up a man's voice. He sounds very close to the mic, like he's sitting right behind the camera. He calmly says, "Still there." And that's it. The tape ends. I mean, it's weird, yeah, but people film weird things. I digitized it with the rest. Here's the part I don't tell people at parties, though. Our software auto-generates thumbnails, 1 frame every 10 seconds, laid out in a contact sheet so customers can preview. When I exported the hallway's tape sheet, frame 204 showed the middle door open. I went back to the footage to check, but at that timestamp, the door is in fact closed. It's closed in the frame before and the frame after. So I tried re-exporting the contact sheet 3 times. The door is still open in frame 204 every time, and I suddenly noticed there was a vertical pale shape in the gap that the compression turns into mush when I zoomed in. I told my manager about this. He watched the footage, looking at the thumbnail, and said the thing I think about most. Don't include that tape in the delivery. I've seen one of these before." One of these? I thought. And he didn't even elaborate. He took the tape and the drive into his office, and I never saw either again. And the customer was only charged for 11. I quit about a year later for normal reasons. The pay, mostly. On my last day, I asked him about it again, figuring he'd finally tell me. He just said the previous time it happened, back in 2013, had also been a hallway. A different house, a different family, a different city that the tapes came from. But the voice? That was the exact same. I do have a load of other stories that are creepy from my time working at this media transfer shop. I could probably fill one of your whole episodes with them. So if you're interested, let me know. Thank you for listening. The Shadow That Never Left, from Corey Marjam. I've been a custodian for a while. A night custodian, to be specific. I get to have an entire building to myself. I've worked for 3 districts, but the first and last ones are what matter. The first time I worked at a local high school. It was on a busy road, so there was always noise. A coworker at the time had her baby and left and didn't come back, so I took over her building. The first time I encountered it was when I was cleaning the auditorium. If you've been in one, you know how huge they are. They're always a pain to clean, too. On this particular day, it was stormy, so naturally when the lights went off, I just assumed the electricity had gone out, thanks to the storm. I started walking toward the door in front of the room, slowly, in the pitch darkness, to find my way out. I stopped in my tracks when I noticed, under the crack of the door, that the lights were on. Okay, that's funny, I thought to myself. Maybe the auditorium has motion sensor lights. I walked back slowly to the middle, waving my arms and screaming bloody murder. Anything to get the lights back on. Nothing. Okay, this is annoying, I thought. Now I have to go find the stage door that leads upstairs. Finally, it occurred to me, hey, maybe I should take out my phone. I did, and I turned on the flashlight. I made my way toward the stage door. I opened it and was hit with this foul odor of BO and wet dog. It comes in handy to remember this later. Okay, I figured, someone didn't shower often and apparently brought their dog. I went up the stairs and into the lit stage control office. There's an exit door to the far right. Remember that door. I finally found the switch that controls the entire room and lights. I flicked the first one, and nothing. Alright, I know I'm not supposed to be touching this stuff, but I hadn't cleaned this area in a week. There's a big show tomorrow. I flicked more switches. I was mumbling something to myself at the time. Then I heard a noise on the stage. It sounded like a piece of wood hitting the stage. Probably just my dust mop handle that I left there. I did leave it at an angle. That has to be it, right? I suddenly got this bad feeling out of nowhere. My instincts told me to close the door to the room I was in. I did, and I locked it for good measure. Back to the control console. I started hitting switches. Suddenly, they all went on for a second, and I saw something standing on the stage just before they went back off. At this point, I was sure my eyes were playing tricks on me. I hit a random switch again, and the stage came on once more. What I saw before was no longer there, yet I had this nagging instinct something was looking at me. The lights on the stage went off. I didn't touch the switch. Then suddenly they all came back on, and I saw what looked like a black mass standing in the middle of the aisle. It was just standing there, looking up at me. The lights went off and then back on, and it had moved up near the stage door. I started to panic. I didn't lock that door. Lights went off, but this time the light that came on was from the hallway leading up to where I was. By then my anxiety kicked in and I froze. The door slammed, like someone shoved into it, and I was still frozen there. Thoughts ran through my head. Why couldn't I move? My wife is in the portables. She won't know what's happening to me. Suddenly I heard what I can only describe as metal hitting metal. Bang, bang. I started to freak out. I was trapped. Remember that exit door I mentioned? The banging was getting worse and worse, and the lights were flicking on and off. This time I went into flight mode and ran for that exit door. The alarm sounded as I went through, blaring through the whole building. I didn't even take the stairs. I jumped completely off. I left that job months later. A year after that, I got another job as a custodian. You guessed it, another high school. And can you believe my luck? I got the newly built building. Even so, there were some strange noises there sometimes. A month into working there, a teacher sadly took her own life. Everyone was told to stay out of the new building, even the custodial staff. I'll admit, I'm a jerk for this. I went upstairs to the outside staircase and peeked into the giant glass doors. Flowers were lined up everywhere. I was touched by how they all loved her, but I felt very rude for going up there. So I said sorry out loud. Before I went to leave, the light on the exit sign went out. Okay, I thought, I'll make sure to put in an FMX request. Still, though, the bathroom lights were able to illuminate the hallway somewhat. As I was turning to walk away, I saw what looked like this black shape come out of the wall of the classroom and into the hallway. Okay, my eyes are playing tricks on me, I thought. It was 10:48 p.m., almost time to go home. Yet this time the shadow thing was just standing there. I think it was staring at me, while I stared back. It didn't move, so I thought maybe it was my own shadow. I did the dumbest thing ever after that. I flipped at the bird. I swear, in response, it straight up ran at me. I hightailed it so fast down the stairs and into the other building. I ran without looking back into the break room. I clocked out, got into my wife's car, and left. She had picked me up, as she always did. I told her the story on the ride home. She told me I'm an idiot. And nothing happened for months after that. All had calmed down, it seemed. Or so I thought. Year 2 started off rocky and bad. My lead left, but before he did, he experienced something with me. One day, as we were talking in the new building, like normal, all the lights went out. I figured we stayed still too long, so the motion sensors went out. We moved, but still, they weren't coming back on. He told me to go upstairs to turn them back on, and he would get the bottom ones. Just as I started to walk, we heard what sounded like someone running full speed down the stairs. Keep in mind, it's 10:56 p.m. There should be no one left here. We both booked it, running out of there. But yeah, he, the lead, quit shortly thereafter. The activity died down a little bit. Here and there were random spots of strangeness or coldness and noises. Occasionally, you'd capture a glance at a figure from the corner of your eye. Later on, I got to move buildings, and I was soon assigned to an older one. But at least this one was nearer to my coworkers, so I wouldn't be so alone. It was quiet there. The feeling was more light, for the most part. Fast forward a month, and things got creepy again. Something started knocking or banging on the walls, or doors or windows too, when I was sitting in a classroom on my break. Sometimes it'll be hushed whispers I'd hear. Now, we're not supposed to sit in the classrooms, but at the time I didn't care. The banging and knocking always caused me to get up and run to look out the hallway or look out the window to see who or what it was. This went on for a while, until it began to sound like doors slamming. That's weird. These doors don't slam. You close them, but they close so slowly on their own that they don't make a sound. The only door here that could slam would be the front door to the building. I went into the hallway and yelled, "Get out of here, it's 8:20 p.m. No one should be here." I stopped and listened. No noise. Maybe it was nothing. I'm just hearing things. One other day, I'm listening to this song by a Korean boy group named ATEEZ, or is that ATEEZ, called Bouncy. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow standing by the science room doorframe. I thought it was my boss for a moment. I turned around to say hey, but no one was there. I was tired and it was late, so I didn't think anything more of it. But the next day, I saw it again. Same thing. So then it was weird. I decided to take out my EVP, an app I have on my phone. Allegedly, it can pick up on things that spirits might say. I used it and called out, "Is anyone there?" Nothing but static. No big deal. So I was right. It's just me being tired again. I connected my Bluetooth back to my phone, and just as it connected, a word came through on the app. Want. Okay. So I called out, "What do you want?" Nothing for a while. I go back to cleaning, but this time I left the app running. After a while, another word came through. You. I asked, "What about me?" More quickly this time, it responded with two words, one after another. "You're" was the first word, and "life" was the second. Nope. I turned off the app, and I left the building to clean the boys' locker room. Before I left, my music turned off, and the EVP turned on, and said to me, "Do not leave." I laughed, and to the ghost hunters of the crowd, ready to call me stupid, I said back to it "F you" and laughed, running out. As of writing this, there was recently a blood moon. I was forced to close for 3 days, starting with that day all by myself. Those were the worst 3 days. I had to clean a coworker's building, who decided to take his leave for 2 weeks. I was in the bathroom cleaning, and I heard whispering that sounded like, "He talked bad to me. How dare he speak to me like that?" It was an angry, hushed whisper, and I swear there was a second voice that said, "Shush." I exited the bathroom and looked around. Of course, there was nothing around. So I went to clean a classroom. I felt uneasy the entire time at work, so I had my wife come and help and hang with me, which was against the rules. But I had permission from my boss. That being the case, I have someone who can vouch for these moments. So back to the blood moon day. I went into the hallway, and from this building I can see directly into mine. I stopped in my tracks when I looked down the hallway into mine. It looked like someone was darting between each classroom, like they were looking for something. Maybe a teacher was still there. They shouldn't be, though. A teacher makes logical sense. I went back to the bathroom to clean it, and those hushed whispers came back. They were speaking, but one was very angry. I heard them say, "He saw you. You were supposed to be sneaky." And the other said, "Sorry, I thought I was." Then the other voice said, "When he gets out, let's get him." Oh, I left the bathroom so fast after that. I put away all the supplies and left the building. I called my wife and she came to keep me company. I saw a coworker, so I waved and he waved. He left at 7 that day and I'm still there till 11. He went back to his building to clean. The campus, I should probably have explained earlier, had 10 small buildings in total, each with a custodian. But this time they all had the day shift, leaving me to do the nights for those 3 days, except this one who worked 11 to 7. At 6:30, my wife came in with dinner, and we started to walk to the break room. Suddenly she stopped me and said, "Look at those 2 owls." It's night by then, with a little red in the sky left. So imagine one creepy owl on the roof of the library staring at you across the cafeteria building. And then, as we were entering the cafeteria building to go to our break room, there's a second owl staring at us. One is hooting, the other is just staring. We entered the building, uneasy, and headed to the break room. As we were eating, my wife heard keys, but around the same time my coworker showed up, letting us know he was leaving. Alright, that probably explains the keys, right? No. We heard him leave, but much later, we heard the keys again, like someone's keyring dangling as they walk. But there should be no one here now, just me and my wife. I looked into the hallway. Nothing. I sat back down and said, maybe it's my keys. I was jouncing my leg, as I always do. ADHD and all that. We both agreed, yeah, it must have been that. I took off my keys and put them on the table. We were watching a clip on her phone on TikTok. But then, she heard the keys again. Now we both had this intense, uneasy feeling. She started panicking, and I started to freak out inside. Like, what was going on? I had no idea. We grabbed everything and ran out. I had to make up a lie later about why I left. The next day, closing again, as a request, my wife showed up. We decided to do an EVP together. We got random words like hi, pretty, mermaid, ice storm, I died here. At some point I asked, where do we go? It said 900. My wife asked me what building that would be. That would be the building with the sports, gymnasium, and weight room. We went over there, and it was empty. I locked up the boys' and girls' locker rooms, and the doors to both entrances and the gym room and weight room. I shut off every light except for the hallway one. That one always stays on. We then went to the break room and relaxed. I went to make rounds at 9:50. Mind you, again, I can't leave till 11. The campus was completely dead. My wife wanted to try the EVP again. We turned it on and instantly a deep voice said, "Leave now." I made a joke, saying, "Make me. You can't do crap." I was being stupid, trying to act macho for my wife. What's sad is I'm 35. My wife told me to stop, so I did. She then asked, "Why do you want us to leave?" Nothing. We kept on walking. Random words would pop up. Eventually we got Roger. I was like, what about Roger? It then picked the words, waiting for you. No thanks, Roger. We both turned the corner. The lights to the weight room and the 900 were on. I asked my wife if we had forgotten them. She said no. And then it dawned on me. If it wasn't us, someone would have to have gone in there, and that didn't make sense, because I'd locked the entrance doors. How could they have gotten into the building? The two of us headed over, and sure enough, the door was locked. How can that be? How did they get in? We walked down the hallway, and sure enough, there was a person in the weight room. I was shocked. So I unlocked the door and asked them how they got into the building, especially this room. They didn't answer me, but assured me that they would get out. This person was flesh and blood, right in front of me. My wife saw him. He was lifting the weights. Alright, whatever. I walked away. He went back to working out. My EVP came on randomly as I pointed my phone toward the window where the guy was. It said the words, "Roger is in the window." I looked back at the guy, and I kid you not, he turned to me and suddenly smiled. I was hoping that was just a friendly smile. We couldn't do much, so we just went out the back door to lock the gate. We headed back into the 900 after that, and the man was gone. But how? The only way out was the gate I just locked. He would have had to walk by me, and the only door in that weight room sounds the entire school alarm if opened. So again, how did he get out? My wife touched the boys' locker room door, thinking maybe he was in there, and it opened. Another how. It was supposed to be locked. Nothing was making any sense. I called out, "Hey, you in there?" No answer. Fine, joke's on him. I locked the door. Then I locked up the entire campus and left for home. The thing is, I never got any reports of a lock-in or anything like that. So good, I guess. That brings us to the last day. Roger was active that day as soon as I stepped onto campus, this entity that called itself Roger. That was a very rainy day. Occasionally, as I'm cleaning the building, I would see someone, or what looked like someone, running up and down the hallway from the corner of my eye. I kept seeing it no matter where I stood. Every time I would run out to try to catch them, but no one would be there. It didn't take long for me to get creeped out. My wife showed up again and we cleaned together, but that night I would have to stay till closing. No more hours to make up for leaving early. I had to stay for sure this time. As we cleaned, she saw someone out of the corner of her eye, standing in front of the door, which was closed, but the door has a long, thin window in it that lets you see out of it. She saw a dark shape like I did before. She turned to look and nothing was there. Then the little window to the door just shattered, and a smell of BO and wet dog surrounded us. We stood there, frozen. My wife was so scared, she started to cry, and I was shaken up. When I heard her say my name, I found my courage. The classroom lights started to flick off and on until they stopped, throwing the room into pitch darkness. I heard my name being called. My wife heard it too. It sounded like my boss, who I'll call Josh. But it couldn't be. He worked 7 to 3 p.m. I texted him, asking, "Are you here?" He replied saying no, and he asked what was up. I replied and told him, "Are you sure you're not in the building calling my name?" He was adamant. Nope, not there. This time, it changed to a guttural sound, and a mixture of Josh's voice and something cold saying, "Corey, open up." My wife and I were freaking out, panicking. We went into the corner of the room where the teacher's desk was, and we crouched and hid there. This time something spoke in my wife's voice. "Baby, please open up." My wife was starting to cry, hearing her own voice from somewhere else. Eventually it got quiet, and that's when we left everything in the room and just left. As my wife was heading out, I had to go back in because I left my phone and headphones. I am a moron at times. I went to the closet and I let the door slam shut. Just as I was walking to the front door, I heard what sounded like a loud guttural scream, followed by heavy footsteps banging down the hallway. I ran as fast as I could, but I didn't tell my wife what happened until later, trying my best not to freak her out even more. The activity slowly died down for a while, but it did make its presence known. It would always show itself in the corner of my eye whenever I was cleaning a room. Occasionally, it would make noises or bang. Nothing as serious as those dreaded 3 days. Eventually, I was promoted to lead and moved to an elementary school. Sadly, this shadow has followed me. Now it's making itself known again. Sometimes it'll walk into a room, and other times it'll stand at the end of the hallway, just staring at me. Most times I can feel its presence right there. I always know when it's there. I feel uncomfortable and have to keep looking around me. This shadowy mass, whatever it is, it has followed me ever since. They only exist in the rearview mirror. From The Inverse. Today I'd like to share not only my own, but my dad's tale about this. This story is pretty self-explanatory from the title. They only appear in the rearview mirror late at night. I've heard accounts of these things, not only from my dad, but from others documenting their encounters online as well. Now let me explain. These things don't follow you on the highway. They chase you. They get so close to the tail of your car that you have to be a good driver to get away. I'm not sure why these things do this to people. Maybe they crave the essence of your fear. Maybe they want to take your life. I still don't know. I'll begin this story with my dad's encounter with them. But first, some background on my dad and his driving skills. My dad was driving before he could ride a bike. Illegal, yeah. When my dad was a preteen, he was working on cars. He spent his years at a little mechanic shop somewhere in Manitoba, Canada. I'll not give the name out, for privacy reasons. After work, he would drive the car he was working on under the cover of night. He would listen to the motor's pitch, and he learned where that perfect sweet spot was to shift gears. He picked up on all this very quickly. Then, during the night, after working on a crappy little car that had absolutely no brakes but a manual transmission, he went for a drive. Yes, he took that very same car out for a test drive. Earlier that day, he had done a tune-up on it. As he let the car slowly roll out of the parking lot, he floored it. He was speeding through town, not a care in the world. Police be damned. He was just a kid. What punishment would they even give him, he thought. The scream of the engine was like music to his ears. The lights reflected off the windshield like a blur of many different colors. He knew he couldn't stop, and that part made him deathly afraid, but also very excited. Adrenaline is one hell of a drug. That's when he made another mistake. He had forgotten that the road was blocked off for construction before the next light. As the yellow tape, orange traffic cones, and construction machines came into view in front of his headlights, his excitement and joy transformed into nothing but pure terror. His chest tightened. What if this was where he crashed? What if this was where he would die? He pushed in the clutch and forced the engine to downshift. He cranked the wheel all the way to the left. The tail end of the car kicked out and started to slide sideways. The streetlights now shone sideways across the front windshield. The engine was screaming as the pen danced up and down at the red line of the RPM meter. The store signs were almost in a perfect reading view. Fluttering the gas pedal, he turned the wheel. The tires moved in a smooth movement from back to center and past, the front tires now facing the right, the back tires laying rubber as they burned against the pavement. The car's weight shifted, and he knew he was back in control. Just before the road straightened out from that corner, he spun the wheel back to center and put the pedal to the metal. This made the car go in the direction of the wheel, and it straightened out. Behind him, twin black streaks on the road in a smooth left-hand curve. Filled with both fear and relief, he smiled. Not just a little grin, but a big ear-to-ear smile. That was when he decided he wanted to become a racer. He eventually slowed down and returned to the shop. Parking the car, he noticed the tires had less tread on them now. Crap. He was going to be in for a mouthful when his boss and the owner of the car found out. So what did he do? Well, of course, he put on some new tires. With knowledge comes responsibility, but also a way to cheat your way out. Later on, he asked a man if he could participate at the upcoming race tryouts at the local track. Long story short, he kicked everyone's butts and ended up racing not only across Canada, but also in the States for years. Being only in the top 5 of every single race, he had perfected his racing and drifting skills. Sadly, this fun life of adrenaline, the sound of roaring engines, and the everlasting smell of burnt rubber would come to an end. During a driver inspection before a race, they asked him to show his driver's license. He didn't have one. He was only 15. So they turned him away. And with that, his new life began. He traveled from Manitoba to his birthplace, not only on foot, but by working odd jobs along the way to buy gas for a car he stole from a parking lot. He moved to a small town in British Columbia, Canada. He started a job at a local sawmill when he turned 17. That's when those things started chasing him in the rear view. Whatever they were, my dad always outran them. He loved it, really. Every time he saw them in the rear view, a crap-eating grin would creep its way across his face. Those nights brought him back onto the track, and he was not going to lose. He had eventually met my mom at the laundromat in town, and they clicked. The thing is, he was a car guy, and she was a horse girl. I ended up with both. It really hurts my wallet. I'm a girl with a heart full of passion, a crappy Chevy, and some driving skills from my dad. Now let me tell you about my first encounter with them. I was working at the local post office, and I was alone that night, closing up, counting the money in the till, when I noticed just how dark it was outside. It was that time of year when the sun set around 4 p.m. After locking up the safe, the doors, and setting the alarm code in case someone tried to break in, I hopped into my car and began my drive home. I had driven that stretch of highway almost every day of my life. I knew where the corners and bridges were, and where the turnoffs of roads were. 23 roads on the right, 21 on the left. That's including short driveways and gravel roads. Home was on the 21st left turn. With that being said, I don't know how these things did what they did. I played some music in my earbuds while I drove my little blue 4-door automatic 2010 Chevy Cobalt. My crappy Chevy that you can't lock, or you would have to break a window to get in. Only 2 doors worked, the driver's door and sometimes the back passenger door. The other 2 have issues. The front passenger door has to be locked after smacking the outside handle closed through the window, or it will open on its own. The back driver's side does not work at all, but I keep it locked anyway. The radio antenna is busted off and sits clutched by the visors. It can still pick up a radio station somehow, but only one channel, and it happens to be a freaking opera station. There is rust along the bottom of the doors, and it only has one working key for the ignition. The other key had been busted off in the passenger door lock. The trunk has a spare custom cut key also trapped in the lock. She gets me from point A to B though, so yeah. I had Rob Zombie's Dragula filling my ears. I was having a great night drive home, and I decided to check my mirrors. When I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing. I was met with the pitch-black darkness behind me, alone on the highway. After I'd passed the empty 9th right turn, there was a short, straight stretch with no turnoffs. So when I checked my rearview mirror again, why were there headlights shining about 10 feet behind my car? My mind was trying to come up with a reason. Maybe I was distracted by looking at the time on the dash, or something along those lines. Suddenly, I was having to squint to see, because whoever was riding my tail was blinding me with those damned headlights. I hate tailgaters. I got mad, I do admit, and I hit my turn signal to make the driver think, oh, I have to slow down to let them turn. Or, if they were as much of a jerk as I thought they were, they would just pass me by and flip me off as they went. I was wrong. Oh God, was I wrong. They crept up even closer. That's when I saw the grill of the truck, and I knew it was a logging truck. It had a light bar on the bottom of the grill and a black paint job. The odd part was that there was no license plate. Those did not have the stopping power other vehicles have. Crap. My eyes went as wide as dinner plates and I floored it. I did not want to get rear-ended. I was going 110 kilometers an hour when I put some distance between us. After I felt like I gave the truck enough space from me, I checked my rear view again. He was right behind me still and creeping ever closer. My taillights shone red on the grill. What the heck is wrong with this guy, I thought, and I sped up even more. I watched my speedometer climb up. 115, 120. I was met by that blinding light again. How did this truck catch up to me that quick? Screw it, I said out loud, and I put the pedal to the floor. 125, 130, and finally 135. I was absolutely flying down this dark highway, praying a deer or moose didn't cross in front of me. I was already terrified at this point. I checked again. The truck was gaining somehow. How was this possible? By now a corner was coming up. My headlights reflected on a road sign, the one indicating that rigs would flip if they took it too fast. I started to feel some relief, knowing that they would have to slow down. I slowed and took the corner, the headlights in my mirror beginning to disappear. I felt the G-force in my car. I took the turn too fast, faster than I should have. I let out a yell and a bunch of swear words when my car sank into the gravity, but made the turn. The corner would straighten out soon. At about 3/4 of the way through, the lights flooded my mirror again. Impossible. The truck should have gone into the ditch at that speed. How? I yelled, for no one to hear. The corner straightened out, and the headlights sped toward the rear of my car. I screamed, gripping the wheel with all my strength, and braced for the moment when that rig would ram into my car. But I was met with nothing. When I next looked into my mirror, the truck was gone. There were no turnoffs at this section of the highway. There was no way in hell the driver would risk turning off all the lights with how active wildlife was in this area. I panicked, thinking maybe the truck did roll and the driver was hurt. I slowed down and I made a U-turn. I drove back, past that corner. I turned around to be in the lane I was just running for my life in seconds ago, and I drove at a crawl close to the edge, searching the ditch for any sign of life. I didn't find that truck. It was like it vanished into thin air. I drove back again and checked both sides of the highway and the ditches. Absolutely nothing. I then slowly drove home and pulled into the only open parking spot in the driveway. I got out and I ran to the door. I was met by my upset mother in her pajamas, housecoat, and slippers, and my visibly confused dad in a white t-shirt, boxers, and socks. I'll call my dad J and mom B for this story. How did you get home so fast? Were you speeding? Did something happen at the post office that made you close early? My mom questioned, the worrywart. No, Mom. Well, yeah, kind of. I was chased by a logging truck, and he tried to ram into my car, but then he disappeared. I went back to see if he rolled into the ditch, but I couldn't find him, I explained. What color was it? My dad piped up. It was black with a light bar on the bottom. Mom nearly shouted. It doesn't matter what truck it was or what color it was. Our daughter was nearly run off the road and killed. Dad sighed, annoyed at Mom's yelling and tone. She could worry about a piece of blank printer paper sitting on the table. It didn't have a plate on the front either, I said. Dad raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. You've got to have both front and back plates in BC. I shrugged. I don't know, Dad. Maybe it was stolen or something. Mom was beginning to settle down now. I'm just so glad you're okay and home safe. She pulled a pack of cigarettes and a lighter from her housecoat pocket and walked to the deck. Dad leaned back and made sure she was out of earshot. He turned to me then, uncrossing his arms and leaning on the stovetop. He whispered, "I've been chased by that truck before, on my way home from work, many times." My eyes went wide. "What?" I whisper-yelled. "Yeah, all the way from the sawmill to the top of the hill." That hill he is talking about is a steep and sharp left-hand turn. He had told me stories of how he used to drift his old silver Trans Am down that hill. He had hot-rodded it up with a slapstick shift kit, roll cage, and 6-point harnesses. He raced people in that car all the time, and it became famous in the area for never losing a race, and also for the gold 01 on the passenger door. If people saw that car, they knew it was Jay. "You never lost to the truck then?" I said. "No, I haven't. I don't know what would happen if I did, though." The sound of the doorknob twisting made both of us jump. Dad looked toward the sound and quickly back to me. He whispered quieter and slowly, "There's more than one. There's a dark red one and a white one." My heart dropped into my stomach. More of those trucks out there, huh? How do they just appear out of thin air, chase you, make impossible moves to close the space, then vanish like it was never there in the first place? I've also had the same experience with the red and white trucks now, all the trucks Dad said he was chased by over the years. And only ever at night, when I was alone on the highway. I did some research online, and only managed to come across the phantom truck of Clinton Road, a Jersey urban legend of a black truck that chases drivers and tries to run them off the road. I live in the middle of nowhere, the middle of British Columbia, Canada. I've not found anything else about them, or anything similar to my area. If you live around BC and have had the same experience of these phantom trucks dressed in black, red, or white paint, let me know. My dad and I want answers. Why were those trucks chasing my dad and me? Why do they still chase me to this day? Drive safe, everybody. Remember to always buckle up and check your mirrors, because the headlights in your mirror might be one of them. Does the mimic follow? From Anonymous. For some anonymity, some details and locations will be changed. I don't live in the same spot anymore, but I do still live in the same city. When my husband, Alex, and I got married back in 2023, we moved into a newly built building. It was a brand new apartment building, with new appliances, new toilets, new flooring. One of the things we really wanted was to have a laundry machine in our own unit, and we got it. My husband works in an office, and I work a hybrid, which means I work a few days in the office, and the rest I work from home. A few months in, we had a routine down. On the days where I worked from home, my clock-in time was the same time when my husband leaves for work. I kiss my husband goodbye, lock the door, put my headphones on, and do my work. This particular morning, I forgot to ask Alex a question before he went in, but it wasn't anything urgent. Sometimes, when I'm too focused on working, I can't hear my coffee machine finish brewing my coffee. It sometimes gets left there until it gets warm or cold, so I end up taking one headphone off one ear. I heard our door open and the shuffling of shoes. "Hey babe," I called out. "Did you forget something?" I kept typing, waiting for a reply, but didn't get one. "Babe," I said again, with no response. I thought it was just one of my neighbors. I went back to work when I heard our powder room door open and swing closed, but not shut. Alex and I are not too comfortable with public washrooms. It would not have surprised me if he came to use the washroom. At that moment, I heard his voice mumble as you would expect someone to sound behind a door and at the other end of the apartment. Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you," I asked. Another mumble. "Sorry, babe, I still can't hear you. Oh, can you please do something for me before you come home today?" I called as I was approaching the powder room. It turns out the powder room was empty the entire time. I thought maybe I got confused with the neighbors again. I was standing next to the laundry room, and I turned around. The laundry machine suddenly made a noise, like it was about to start. I quickly opened it to stop it from starting when empty. It was strange, but I still thought it was just the machine resetting. I later told Alex about it. We both laughed it off as having very thin walls. When we both have to go into our offices, I usually get home within 45 minutes before him, at most. Sometimes he walks in when I'm still putting my stuff down, taking my lunch containers out. A few weeks after the previous event, I got home and was in the kitchen when I heard the keys turn and the door opening. I heard the light switch turn on as well, so I shouted, "Hey babe!" There wasn't any response. I turned to face the foyer, and the light was on. Sometimes he has earbuds in, and I assumed he didn't hear me. I heard and saw our coats shuffling, so I said a little louder, "Babe, are you home?" "Yes, I am," he said in his typical tired voice. "How was your day?" I asked, as I heard the tap turn on in the powder room. When I went to check, no one was there, and the tap wasn't even on. At this point, I was scared to know what I'd been talking to. My family believes in spirits, and always told me to be careful what I bring home. My parents were always worried about me because I loved thrifting and listening to scary stories. They were afraid I might invite something in. I took it with a grain of salt until these were happening more often. One time, Alex was home alone. He said he had heard, "Hey babe, guess what I got?" in my voice. He replied, "What?" as he was coming to the front door. Lo and behold, I wasn't there. We kept having these little conversations at home when we think it's each other. We've since moved from that apartment to a new building. We don't hear our voices anymore, but we do occasionally hear doors swinging and our machines making noise in our apartments. I was recently home alone and thought I heard another mumbling by Alex. I'm just curious. Can these mimic things follow wherever we go? Creepy Cabbie from Sheev76. I have cerebral palsy, but I've always worked while at and after leaving college, sometimes having 2 or 3 jobs at a time. When this incident happened, I was 22, renting my bungalow and living alone. I was going to work. My main job at the time was as a dance, fitness, and play therapy assistant to a group of therapists working for young people with physical and learning disabilities and extreme behavior disorders. As a full-time wheelchair user, I had to use a cab to travel to and from work. And although most of the guys driving for the cab firm were solid and really nice, there were a few, well, dodgy ones, as in most walks of life. I could transfer quite easily, so all the drivers had to do was hold my wheelchair steady, then fold it up, then put it in the boot. On this day, the guy turned up at 8:30 a.m. Late. I proceeded to transfer. I felt him right up close behind me. His hand brushed lightly over my back and bottom. It's worth mentioning I've had slight issues with this man before, mostly making smutty remarks and asking me out for a drink. I declined, and when I did, he got slightly nasty. I ended up having to report it to the firm. As I'm disabled, there wasn't much I could do, as I was holding myself up and I couldn't let go of the door. I swore at him, managing to swing around to sit in the car, and told him never to do that again. He just laughed and smirked at me. We started to drive. 10 minutes in, I noticed we weren't going the regular route to get to the center where I worked. As I was already late for work, I was angry, so I asked him about this. He ignored my questions and said, in a cold voice, "You know, I live around here. I could take you to my flat where my 3 mates are. There wouldn't be anything you could do about it." When he said that, I was crapping myself inside. But I said to him in my bravest voice, "Well, if I'm much later, work's gonna call me, and they have your firm's details too." With that, he scowled at me big time, and after a while, I soon recognized our usual route to work. When I arrived at work, my boss was worried. He saw the driver, whom he didn't have time to deal with either, and asked me if I was okay. After a while, I was able to tell my supervisor what happened. She first called the cab firm, then the police, who came to interview me at work, and then talked to the man. I'm not sure what happened to him, but I never saw him again. Keep your lights on for food delivery drivers. From Anonymous. When 2020 came around, I lost my job with KFC but still needed a way to pay bills. So I started to work with Uber Eats. I actually enjoy doing it. Being introverted and going into places where the only communication necessary is, "Hi, I'm here for so-and-so," well, that's a dream come true for folks like me. Most orders when the pandemic started are leave-at-door orders anyway. But there's one specific order that creeped me out, enough so to start looking for jobs where I'd be inside a building with locks again. The order at first was no different than any other. I went and got the food and went to the house. The light was on when I walked up. I took the food out of my bag, setting it on a bench on the porch, when the light went out and I heard something hit the bush behind me. I quickly took the necessary picture of the order and began to get out of there when I saw a guy peek from the edge of the house where the garage was. So I just decided to cut across the yard back to my car, acting like I didn't see anything, and I climbed back in my car quick. When I looked back from locking my door, the guy had a knife and was coming towards my vehicle. I floored it out of there. I decided after this, I wasn't staying online that night. I would just stay home. Now I'm nervous about any house that doesn't have the lights on. And some nights, it's more than those that do. Deranged Custodian. From Jim Slice. A few years back, while I was working towards my associate's degree at a local community college, I worked at a grocery store to make ends meet. Like the majority of retail jobs, there was a lot to hate. Rude bosses, corporate red tape, irate customers, and of course, pay that never satisfied. As a night owl, I naturally gravitated towards the closing shift. It afforded me some relative peace and quiet for the last few hours of my workday, and I didn't have to worry about stickler bosses breathing down my neck. However, as the store got closer to closing time, the stranger the people were that I would encounter. And I'm not just talking about customers. It must have been about a year into working there that I first encountered him. It was a new custodian, making his rounds through the store with a broom and a dustpan. The name tag on his shirt said Tyler. Aside from his long, unkempt hair, the thing that stood out to me the most about him was just how big he was. He was the type of guy who wasn't particularly overweight or muscular, but simply had a very large build that made him quite imposing. Despite this, he seemed relatively harmless. He had a strange demeanor, and he muttered to himself, but he mostly kept his head down and did his work. There are a lot of moving parts in your average supermarket, so it's not uncommon to barely see someone you work with all day if they're not in the same department as you. Tyler didn't cross my mind too much if he wasn't making a sweep of the produce department where I worked. But that would change very soon. I and many other employees of the store made frequent stops to the restroom, partially for brief respite from the mind-numbing work, and also because the water fountains were over there. We were somehow not allowed to have water bottles in our departments. You could always tell if a custodian was spiffying up the restroom if their supply cart was parked outside of it. However, Tyler started parking his cart inside the restroom, and also began to spend exorbitant amounts of time in the furthest stall from the entrance, muttering to himself. On top of this, he would strip his clothes off and hang them over the stall door. It came to a point where every time I took a bathroom break, he would be in there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One coworker had barely entered the restroom one day when Tyler busted out of the stall, thankfully in some underwear, not fully nude, before angrily saying, "I don't want to crap in here." He then entered the next stall over. Being alone in that bathroom with the enormous half-naked custodian gave my coworker a scare he would not soon forget. In spite of his bizarre bathroom ritual, I felt a little sorry for Tyler. Every job in that store was thankless, but especially so for the custodians. They had to deal with the biggest messes, and I knew that the most repulsive ones, such as the ones involving bodily fluids, were supposed to be dealt with by managers who had the proper training. But that role would conveniently be forgotten when the time came, leaving it up to the poor custodians. For this reason, I tried to be friendly to Tyler, asking him how his day was, making small talk. He would give a sheepish response, but he seemed almost weirded out by me doing this. Perhaps nobody else in the store gave him the time of day, or maybe he simply wanted to be left alone. As it turned out, Tyler really hated when he had to clean up one of those big messes. There were multiple instances where I would hear an announcement over the loudspeaker, paging him to clean up a mess in a certain department, only for me to see him a minute or so later in a big huff on his way to the disaster area. I didn't want to get in his way during times like that, but one day there was a mess in my department, and it was not a small one. I was doing my work, probably daydreaming, when an apologetic parent told me that their kid had vomited by the basil. I stifled my exasperated sigh and assured them it was going to be okay. Somebody would clean it up right away. I resolved right then to clean it myself, as I knew Tyler was there that day, and I did not want to be the target of his rage. The vomit-absorbent bags were kept at the foot of the stairs that led to the employee break room, so I made my way over there. Right as I reached the stairs, Tyler had made his way down. Now I had to tell him. All I could say was his name before he looked at me and screamed, "I know!" I stood there in shock for a few seconds before going back to work. I guess they'd paged him already and I didn't hear it. I stayed out of his way completely after that. I didn't witness anything that happened hereafter, but trust me, it was the talk of the store and easy to piece together. It must have been about a month after Tyler screamed at me that he got into a big row with one of the managers, right at the front of the store by the cash registers. Tyler's hours had been cut, and he was not happy about it. The manager that he was getting into it with was, no joke, probably half Tyler's size. The argument got so heated that Tyler was about to hit the manager. Before he could deliver the blow, the customer service lead, Emily, got in between them. That successfully disarmed the situation, but Emily later admitted to one of my coworkers that she genuinely thought at the moment Tyler was going to punch her instead. Thankfully, nobody got hurt, but Tyler did get sent home for the day. A few nights later, Tyler showed up at the store at 2 a.m., thinking he was scheduled when he wasn't. He was banging on the back door near the loading docks trying to get in. There are some overnight workers when the store is closed, but they always come in through the main entrance. Nobody could hear his banging from the sales floor. He started screaming and kicking the door, and he even screamed Emily's name a couple of times, threatening her. After half an hour or so, he finally gave up and left. This was only discovered the following day, when the security cameras were reviewed. He was already on thin ice by then for the incident with the manager, but now they were ready to fire him the next time he came in. But Tyler never showed up again. After about a week, when they were sure he wouldn't be coming back, they cleaned out his locker. And the only thing they found in his locker was a piece of paper. The entire page was filled with the name Emily and crude, violent drawings. Emily quit that day. I didn't last much longer myself. Restless Spirits, from Anonymous. This experience taught me there is sometimes more going on than what your five senses can pick up. I left this job years later after I was in some dangerous situations that had nothing to do with the paranormal, but I had some great memories there. A little background about the program I worked for. This was a social service job where we would take homeless young adults and help them pay rent for an apartment while we taught them life skills, job skills, and tenancy skills. It was a government-funded program. So one of the stipulations was that we could only rent the absolute cheapest livable apartments in a very impoverished area. Livable was a relative term because our inspector was not allowed to touch or move anything while he inspected those apartments. So essentially, he was just guessing if they were safe to live in or not. I had a lot of issues with the way the program was run and funded, but they aren't relevant to this story. Anyway, my team and I moved 2 young men into an upstairs unit of a quadruplex and 2 young women into a downstairs unit in the same building. Shortly after moving them in, one of the boys complained about cars driving down the road next to the building many times per night, and the silhouettes of the people outside would project onto his bedroom wall. It freaked him out at first, but then he started to get used to it. I thought it was a little weird since no one was ever standing around out front when I visited, but for safety reasons I only visited the clients during the day, so I had no idea what was going on there at night. Generally though, in that part of town everyone stayed inside. It wasn't the type of neighborhood where you socialize in the street. A few weeks later, one of the girls living downstairs reported a similar experience. Her bedroom was in the back of the building, but one night she was up late in the living room facing the street, and when a car drove by she saw silhouettes of people on the closed blinds. She was so scared she made her boyfriend look between the blinds to see how many people were standing in front of the building. Well, he looked between the blinds, but replied that there was no one there. She thought maybe they were doing drugs in the patch of grass in front of the building, and then scattered when that car drove by. Luckily, her boyfriend was able to calm her down, but she told my coworker about it at their next meeting. Because of HIPAA privacy laws, we weren't allowed to tell her that an upstairs resident had reported something similar, because that would out him as being part of our program. One morning, I woke up to a bunch of missed calls from that boy living upstairs. I called him back and his voice was shaking as he told me. "Last night, the shadow thing happened again, and I looked out the window and no one was there. I can't stay here anymore. Something here is seriously messed up." I went to his apartment and talked it through with him. I used to be a camp counselor after all, so I was used to kids waking up from nightmares or shadows that could easily be explained away. "Do you think maybe people were in the yard doing things they weren't supposed to? Like maybe they were doing drugs and ran away from the headlights so they wouldn't get caught?" I asked. "It looked like they were standing right outside the window," he said. Since he lived on the second floor, there was no reason why someone would or could be standing right outside his window. Of course, it's hard to tell distance when all you are seeing are shadows. I tried to explain this to him, but he wasn't having it. He ended up sleeping on a friend's couch for a few nights, before returning to his own apartment. At the office, I explained the situation to my coworker, who told me one of the girls in the downstairs apartment had just bought a door camera. This was before Ring doorbell cameras, so think of an older and cheaper version of that, not connected to the internet. My coworker and I brainstormed ways we could ask her to check the camera footage without violating the boy's privacy. We decided to tell her that our boss was concerned about her and her roommate's safety, and if she found proof of people hanging around her apartment late at night, she could show us the footage. She agreed, and we asked her to look at last night's footage to see if there was anything concerning. She texted back that last night was all good, but she would try to remember to check every morning to see if there was anything at all unusual. She never did text us any updates, so I'm not sure if she checked every morning. But if she did, I guess she didn't see anything. If I remember correctly, the camera could only hold a day or two of footage anyway before it was erased, so if she didn't check it the next day, she wouldn't see a thing. I'm also not sure if it stopped happening, or if they all just got used to it, because we all kind of forgot about it eventually. A few years later, my coworker and I had moved on to other jobs, and out of the blue she sent me an article. The article explained that decades ago, there had been a natural disaster which had destroyed dozens of the slums in the area, killing hundreds. Instead of identifying the bodies and trying to notify the next of kin, their bodies were thrown into a mass grave. They didn't even record the exact number of bodies. They just dug a hole, put them in, and covered it up. It's not clear who knew about the mass grave when apartments or new slums were built on top. I wonder if the landlord's insurance made them rebuild instead of getting a payout, or if the land was sold to developers cheaply, so they weren't asking too many questions. I live in a state where sellers do not have to disclose deaths on the property, and this was almost 100 years ago now, so I have no idea how things were done in those days. Since the natural disaster happened during the time of segregation, the white victims were buried in the local cemetery, but anyone not presenting as white was thrown in the mass grave instead. The article talked about an advocacy group who had advocated for all the buildings on top of the grave to be bulldozed and a memorial be placed for the victims. Today, the area is fenced off and covered in well-manicured lawn with a plaque honoring the victims. I'm not sure if it's important to the story, but our 4 clients who lived in the quadruplex were not white. Knowing what I know now, I would have asked more questions. Were those silhouettes moving or standing still? Were they adults or children? Were they the same ones each night, or did they change? I wonder if the ghosts were aware of my clients and the similar injustices they had inherited. Again, I think race and class are important to my story, which is why I've included them. If I were to guess, I think the spirits didn't know they were dead, and were wandering around, trying to make sense of things. When the audience wasn't there. From Lurking Moonlight. I remember back in the late 80s, my grandparents took me to a theater show. I was in my early teens at the time, stubborn as a mule, and honestly, I fought tooth and nail. I kept saying I'd rather be at the movie theater, popcorn, action, explosions, anything but a stage play. But my grandparents insisted, and so did my mother. Get a little culture, they said. See something different for once. I didn't want to admit it, but I'm glad they pushed me. At the time, I was young, hard-headed, thought I knew everything. But that day ended up changing my life. We went to see this traveling production of Phantom of the Opera. I didn't know the company, didn't know any theater companies at all. Theater was not my world back then. But I remember sitting there, watching the Phantom disappear under the stage, seeing the smoke and mirrors, cheap tricks really, and still being blown away. The singing, the atmosphere, the way the story wrapped around the room. I didn't know it then, but that awoke something in me. A part of me that loved this stuff, theater and music and performance, which had previously been buried down. After the show, my grandparents said, "See, that wasn't so bad, was it?" And I said, "Not bad. I want to see more of these." So for the next few years, all the way through high school, I traveled with them to see shows. Big ones, small ones, goofy little productions in tiny towns, you name it. I loved every minute of it. Funny thing is, I never did theater in high school. It wasn't the same. They always picked some cheesy comedy or something overly serious, and the atmosphere just felt wrong. And I didn't want to get mixed up in the school drama scene, pun intended. But later on in college, I finally dipped my toes into acting. A little show here, a character there, nothing major, just enough to see what it felt like from the stage instead of the seats. Then I got involved with a traveling production company. And man, that was it for me. I felt like I'd found my home. The people and the chaos and that energy, I loved it. I finished school, sure, but the theater took over my heart. 20 years later, I'm still at it. Still traveling and performing, loving every minute of it. I've met some incredible people, traveled all over the US, even outside of it a few times. And I even met my wife through the theater. I built my whole life from a show my grandparents dragged me to. I've got nothing to complain about. But let me tell you something. The theater has its strange moments. Not the movie-style sandbag falls and kills someone kind of stuff, and definitely no masked phantoms lurking backstage. But spooky things? Things that stick with you. Yeah, there's been a few of those. And I'd like to tell you one of them. We traveled through Massachusetts and down the East Coast, making our way through the Carolinas. But honestly, our show attendance wasn't what it used to be. Great crowds do come some nights, barely a dozen people on others though. Our production manager kept saying the same thing, "I think we need to flip the script." He'd say that anytime things got stale, and this time he meant it. "We've been running these top 4 shows for too many years," he said. "They're outplayed. People want something new." I rolled my eyes. I figured theater life was about to turn into high school productions all over again. Cheap comedies, awkward attempts at seriousness. I didn't want any part of that. But, like usual, I was wrong. He flipped through a stack of obscure scripts, mumbling to himself, and finally slapping one down like he'd found hidden treasure. The Mystery of Irma Vep. I had never heard of it. Most of us hadn't. A horror comedy full of quick changes, odd characters, and strange little scenes. We practiced for hours. Luckily, we had a few weeks between shows because the next theater down in South Carolina was booked with opera and some kind of dance festival. So we rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. By the time we were a few weeks out, social media was just becoming a thing. So we blasted out a post saying we'd be adding this weird little horror comedy to our lineup. That was all it took, and it sold us out clean. Turns out people love a horror comedy. And I actually loved practicing it. I played Thomble, Lord Finwick's hapless groundskeeper, a goofy little side character who popped up with dramatic warnings and badly timed entrances. I had the time of my life with it. So there we were, still up in North Carolina, rehearsing in this old theater before heading south. One night, after a long day, everyone had filtered out. Some went home, some went to the dressing rooms, a few wandered backstage. My wife had already gone back to our hotel, but I stayed behind. I really wanted to nail my lines. Horror comedy or not, I took the role seriously. I sat on the stage reciting lines to an empty house, listening to the sound of my own voice bouncing off the seats. At one point, I stopped mid-rehearsal and walked to the center of the stage. I took a deep breath, lifted my head toward the empty audience, and belted one of Thomble's dramatic lines. "My lord, the shadows move where shadows should not." Right after I said it, I heard applause. Not thunderous applause, of course, but a polite, scattered clapping from somewhere out in the dark. I froze up. I looked around, thinking someone was hiding and trying to mess with me. "Ha ha, very funny," I said. I turned to walk back to my starting place and ran through the scene again. Same line, same delivery. And again, the same applause. Slightly louder this time. So I called out, "Okay, whoever's out there, come on, you got me." Silence. I couldn't see anyone. No footsteps or doors opening. Only a quiet old theater, late at night. I spoke to the empty seats. "Well, I'm glad you liked it." Still no answer. So I figured I'd put on a show for my invisible audience. I jumped back into my role, really hamming it up, energetic, exaggerated, and teetering between sarcastic and serious. Then I spun around for the final line and shouted into the dark. And this time the applause was big, loud, and full, like an entire crowd had filled the theater while my back was turned. I spun toward the sound booth, thinking someone had kicked on a recording. But the booth was down front right, just off the edge of the stage, and it, at that moment, was empty. I'd been there for weeks. I knew every corner of that place. Nobody was hiding there. There was no one playing tricks. That was the moment the hairs on my arms lifted straight up. You know that cold prickle you get when the air changes, and you're suddenly aware you're not alone? Yeah, that feeling hit me hard. And right then, I decided that was enough practice for the night. After that, I just went back to the hotel. I went in and my wife was asleep on the bed. I wasn't going to complain. She normally asks me to rub her feet because she's a lot of the time the dancer. She's always doing a lot of heavy lifting. By that I mean she's always around the stage and her feet always ache. But I thought, I'll just tell her in the morning. So I lay down, and first thing in the morning I woke up to the smell of coffee. When I rolled over and looked, my wife was just sitting there reading the script. I said to her, "Hey, I've got to tell you something that happened to me." I ran through it with her and told her. I said, "Who do you think it was out in that audience? What do you think they were doing?" She named a few people that might pull such a prank, but she said, "Honestly, nobody would really do that. I mean, sure, I can't say they wouldn't, but why would they?" Well, I shrugged my shoulders and said, "I guess I'll just have to see what happens." So we went to the theater later that afternoon. They'd been rehearsing. I knew my scene was coming up soon, so I'm in the backstage running through my lines under my breath, just running through the hand gestures and the motions without saying anything. Then I decided I wanted to put a little emotion into it. There I was, waving my arms and mouthing my line, and I could hear something up front, the scene, but it almost drowned out my own thoughts. So I spoke up, just ever so softly, so they couldn't hear me through the curtains and everything, and when I said my line, I heard clapping behind me. I spun around. Now, if you've ever been on a stage, you know they're all painted black. There are curtains around and ropes and whatnot, but behind me it was just that black cinder wall. The ropes were off to the left for the stage. The catwalk entrance was clear on the other side. I looked up. No catwalks above me, no shadows, and nowhere for anyone to stand. But that clapping was almost directly behind me, like someone was standing inches away. That same feeling came back. The hairs on my arms stood up straight. The little cold chill that follows. I didn't know what to think of it. I said to myself, "All right, I think I'll be good until I get out there. Now let's see if this prankster will do it when the whole cast is out there." So I took my spot on stage. We ran through the whole scene, I said my lines, and nothing. No applause this time, nothing at all. I thought, it's got to be somebody here then. I kept trying to figure it out. Even my wife had been looking around when she had a moment to spare. Needless to say, the theater in South Carolina had just called my production manager, told him they had a week's worth of cancellations, and that we could come in just a week and a half instead of 3 weeks out. That's great news. He'd already been talking to them about boosting ticket sales, and he had sold out the first weekend before we even arrived. But that only put pressure on us. I knew my lines, I felt confident, but the perfectionist in me wanted to be absolutely spot on. So after rehearsal that day, I ran through the same motions. But this time I walked around the theater, up and down the aisles, checking the backstage. 2 actresses were talking in a dressing room. The production manager was in his office on the phone. And again, my wife had gone home. She was exhausted. I said, "Okay, there are only like 3 people here, so it has to be one of them." Well, I started rehearsing, and for the first half hour or so, there wasn't much. But there must have been something about that line, because when I got to my part and repeated that line and turned toward the audience and made my hand gestures, this time it was a full-on clapping, an applause with cheers and hurrahs. I looked at the sound booth. I walked right down there and jumped in. I ripped that power cord out from the sound panel, pushed the power button off and on several times. I was beside myself. "What the hell is going on?" I said. Then I said it louder. "If you don't want me to perform, then fine. At least have the courage to come out and tell me, because you're really freaking me out." I threw my hands up, almost threw my script. "That's it," I said. I got back on the stage and was ready to go home. "Okay," I said. "I just unplugged everything. Let's see if it happens again." Once more, I ran through that last scene. When I turned and yelled my line, I was met with what sounded like ear-deafening applause. Cheers, screams, whoops, and hollers. But there was nobody there. The speakers were up high. I know when sound is coming from speakers, and old speakers hum, or they buzz and they crackle. This sound did not do that. This was real. Too real. I turned, grabbed my script, and off I went, back to the hotel room. After that, I just stayed in the hotel room, practicing on my own. I didn't want to go back and practice by myself. You can call me a coward or whatnot, a scaredy cat, but it is what it is. I had my lines down, I knew what they were. Then it came, just 3 or 4 days later, the end when we were packing everything up and going to make our way down to the next theater and set up residence there and get prepped for that weekend show. Our stage manager said, "Okay, it's a dry run. Let's go. Beginning to end, full scenes, whole 9 yards." So we ran through it. And even after my famous line, there was nothing. But you know, the play wasn't over. And when it came down to it, and we took our final bow at the very end, an eruption of applause came, the whole shebang that I had experienced. Our production manager even turned, startled, and started to laugh hysterically. This took the tension off of all of us. His laughter was contagious, one of those guys who can make the whole room crack up to the point you nearly pee your pants. He was laughing and crying, gut-wrenching. He turned to us and said, "Whoever set that up, that is the most hilarious thing in the world. Trying to scare us by putting up a ghost applause. Way to go. I think we should do this at every show." He wiped the tears from his eyes and we just stood there. Several of us were like, "I didn't do that." I said, "I definitely didn't do it, but it's actually happened to me here before." The production manager sat there and said, "You guys are funny. I don't buy that for 1 minute though, but thanks. Now let's get packed up and go." And that's what it was left at. All I know is when we're traveling through North Carolina to that theater again, I don't want to practice that play there. As much as I like it, I think I'll pass. The Old Mayor, from Michigan Deputy. I had a conversation with a ghost on duty, and he actually was a really nice guy. I'm a sheriff's deputy on the west side of Michigan. For the last 3 years, I've been assigned to a patrol area on the eastern edge of the county that surrounds a small town, and I've become close friends with the officer for the town's police department that works the same night shift as me. For obvious reasons, I won't be using real names of places or people involved in the story. I'll go by M myself, and my friend, the small town officer, is E, and our other coworker is D. E and I have had paranormal encounters on shift before. A couple of years ago, we were walking through an abandoned school when a chair moved right in front of us, with no one around. E has also had many other paranormal experiences, both at work and in his personal life, which range from being touched by a ghost to being screamed at by the local witch. As for D, he has a paralyzing story of his own that entails a demon haunting a cabin in the woods that his friend won the ownership to during a poker game. Personally, I saw the ghost of a little girl standing in my backyard when I was in high school, so it's fair to say we are no strangers to the paranormal. In order to understand this story, I need to give a little bit of background. The small town where E works is in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields and forest. It's the only semblance of a town for at least 15 miles, and the river runs right through its heart. In large part, the town still runs on the river, the same economy that brought people to the area almost 2 centuries ago. The police station is in the same building it's always been since the early 1900s. It's been renovated and modernized several times, but the bones of it are the same. The station is attached to Town Hall, the mayor's office, and the rest of the government administration space for the town. And according to E, the building is haunted by the ghost of the old mayor from the early 1900s. One day in early November, During a particularly slow, cold, and rainy shift, D got the bright idea to take his spirit box app to the town hall. D, E, and I discussed it and decided it would be a fun idea to see if we could make contact with the ghost of the old mayor. About 10:30 at night, we walked into the police station, and D turned on the app. We began to walk around, seeing what EMF readings we could find, going to the spots where the mayor had allegedly been seen in the past. At first, there was nothing crazy, just some normal EMF readings. No words came through, nothing indicated the mayor was present. Then E took us through the town hall side of the building. We walked through the doors and immediately the EMF detector spiked, and a random word appeared on the app. I can't remember what it was, but I do remember the word didn't make any sense, and didn't seem to be connected to a presence. D began walking around the area and got a huge EMF spike in what appeared to be a meeting room. He walked around and tried to determine what the cause could be, but we couldn't figure it out. There were no electronics in the room that we could see, not even phones or a TV. D then returned to where the spike appeared originally, and the readings were normal. Suddenly, there was no EMF in the room. We walked around some more with nothing to show for it, as we decided to pick a spot and started talking about unrelated things. D left the app on and we completely forgot about it for 20 or so minutes. Then we heard a voice and realized it was the app. The word that appeared was move. We looked around, each of us confused, wondering if we had a bad reading of something that triggered the word. Then the word came again, along with a big EMF spike. The area where we had decided to stop and talk was behind the reception desk at the front of the town hall. This area is where the clerks would sit and speak through a plexiglass window to the town residents that came in for whatever business they needed to conduct. E was standing to my right, near one of the clerks' desks. D was by the employee door to the area, and I was leaning against the reception desk with that plexiglass window, my back turned to the entry area. To see if this was true interaction from a spirit, D asked who was speaking to us and who needed to move. There was silence for a few minutes. Then the app said, bracelet. Again confused, D asked who needed to move. The app said, cross. Then move again. D and E both looked at me, putting the pieces together, and said they were talking to me. I have a tattoo sleeve on my arm that has a big cross dead center, easily visible to anyone looking at me. And at this time I had my sleeves rolled up, so it was visible. I also wear a bracelet on my wrist every day, even while at work. We all were getting super excited, figuring this was actual contact from a spirit inside the building, and possibly the mayor himself. I did move, and I apologized, saying I wasn't trying to get in the way. We asked some more questions, but got no response. We moved out of the clerk's area and into the main entry area of the town hall. We kept asking questions and got more vague responses, with some EMF spikes that seemed to be moving randomly. I then asked if the spirit could tell us who they were. After a long pause, the app told us, Michael. We said hello, asking Michael to tell us more about himself. Then, the strangest thing happened. I got this sudden urge to look around the space more closely. I began studying the walls and turned almost 180 degrees before my eyes locked on a plaque by the main doors to the town hall. Before I knew what was happening, I walked over to the plaque and immediately found the name Michael on it. I yelled out to D&D, putting my finger directly on Michael's name, telling them to come look at what I found. They walked over, and the app said, point. Realizing what just happened, we asked the app if he was the Michael on the plaque, and the app said, yes. Michael turned out to be one of the members of the town hall board that allocated and pushed for funding for the building. E looked up the story on his phone and found that Michael was one of the people that pushed for the town to replace the old and outdated town hall in the early 1900s, and advocated for the growing town to have a modern government building to keep up with the modernization of the area. Michael also was one of the people who broke the ground on the building, and even helped to build part of it. Unfortunately, Michael had died an untimely death in a farming accident only a few years after the town hall was built, right in the middle of his run for mayor. As E was reading this aloud, I felt warm static coming over my back. It had felt friendly and happy. I know that's strange to say, but the feeling didn't make me uneasy. There was no animosity or danger, no fear to it. It felt as if Michael was standing right behind me, thanking me for recognizing him and allowing us to appreciate and admire what he had done before his death. Then the app said, "Bye," and that feeling left instantly. And so did Michael, I guess. We never got another response from the app, and no EMF spots. It was as if Michael found some kind of peace that night and decided to rest. Since then, E hasn't had any encounters with Michael. D is now working another area on another shift, so we haven't had the chance to go back and try this again. But I wonder if we maybe helped Michael find some kind of peace. I wonder if we helped him cross over into the afterlife by recognizing him and appreciating what he did for the community. I'm sure someday E and I will get brave enough to download another Spirit Box app and try this again. And if we do, I'll document what happens here. But above all else, this experience helped me to understand what can keep a soul restless on Earth. After the smoke clears. From Bryant. I was never one to care for people. I would never go out of my way to meet someone new or start a conversation. But there was one place I felt comfortable. In nature. That's the reason I wasted 4 years of my life to become a Firewatch Ranger. I won't be mentioning the name of the state park I worked for, so nobody goes trying to find what I found in those woods that summer. But we'll get there when the time comes. I'll try to explain a bit about firewatching. You sit in a tower with no internet, and you make sure nothing gets set on fire. A simple job, until people get involved. Well, people isn't the best word for what I saw in those woods. One thing different there than other parks was that 2 people were assigned to a single tower. My supervisor put me with Ash, a fitting name for someone who dealt with fires. We were polar opposites, though. I was a very outdoorsy person, and she was more of a hermit who barely left the tower. We never really talked, except for when we argued about the amount of stupid books she ordered every time we got a supply crate. They took up almost half of the crate. It was so annoying. We barely had enough food to last us to the next delivery. But one time, when we were arguing, I was pacing back and forth until I noticed one of the floorboards was very loose. I bent down and picked up the board, expecting it to just go straight through to another board. But it didn't. There was a compartment filled with about 8 journals, more so thin notebooks of about 100 pages each. Ash dropped down right beside me, flipping through one of them, and we realized they were from the last people stationed at this very watchtower. We spent 3 days reading those journals. 3 entire days. They were written by 2 people, but their names weren't in there. They all ended on a single day, 6 months before we got there. Both writers talked about a frequent rumbling shaking the tower. "Well, that's unsettling," Ash said, glancing at me. Nothing else happened for a while. It took about 6 weeks for us to start feeling what the journals mentioned. A slow rumbling coming from the west. It scared me, and that didn't happen often. Nothing else happened at first. It was one of the most boring things ever. But every so often you would hear that faint rumbling from the west. Ash decided to ignore it. No matter what she heard, she thought it was just some sort of earthquake, and tried to take her mind off of it. That's what I should have done. Instead, I went out to the west every so often, trying to see what was making the noise, trying to see if someone was out there doing something. But no matter how hard I looked, the west was always empty. There was a campsite here or there, but no one was really out there, except for one or two people who weren't doing anything suspicious. Then came the day the fire broke out. The main office said it was just some dry leaves. Some other people said it was set on purpose. It happened at a campsite, which is why people were speculating as much as they were. At the time, I believed it was just dry leaves and a spark, maybe some idiots who didn't know how to put out a fire the right way. But after that, there was no more rumbling for about 3 weeks, until I heard something walking under the tower. Ash was out, trying to retrieve some supplies. I looked down through the hatch at one point, but I didn't see anything. I went all the way down to the ground to check things out. The dirt had been disturbed there. I looked closely. The tracks appeared to be a deer's, so I didn't have anything to worry about. When Ash got back, I didn't say a word. Why would I need to tell her about deer tracks? Just normal business. That night, however, there was more shaking, waking up both me and Ash. Suddenly, the ground collapsed right underneath us. The tower fell from 80 feet above the ground. We were both severely injured. The paramedics took 40 minutes to arrive. By then, Ash was gone. Later, I was stationed at another watchtower with a man named Daniel. I didn't really get to know Daniel, because soon after, something started to show up. Something insanely tall, with long appendages. It was able to reach into the tower, breaking right through the glass. The next thing I knew, Daniel was gone. I have no idea what it was, or if it was even real. But if it wasn't, then how was Daniel dead? After 2 incidents of people dying around me, the authorities had me as a person of interest. But they had no real evidence, so all they did was reassign me to another tower, this time with a man named Jeremiah. I got close to Jeremiah over the next month and a half, getting to know him well before his end. Everything was easygoing for the longest time, until the final day. On that day, 4 of those things, the very things that had taken Daniel, surrounded the watchtower, one on each side. The glass broke. I heard things clawing in and reaching inside. Some of them were going for me. I jumped through the hatch, running 400 meters away from those monsters until I couldn't see them anymore. I ran and ran until I made it to my car, and I drove straight for a police station. It wasn't too far, thankfully, but it was too late. Jeremiah was not there when they got there, and now people were starting to call me crazy. They threw me out of the Firewatch program. I went home, went online, and used my ability to own firearms to order every single weapon I could get off Amazon that I could afford. And I'll be taking it all with me if I ever go back into those woods. Contorting. From What Do I Do for My Pen Name? The incident started happening 3 days before my birthday. On February 1st, I was at my McDonald's job. My shift was from 5 a.m. to 11 a.m. At 5:30, a guy walked in. I asked him what he wanted, and in a calm, raspy voice, he said, "1 cheeseburger with water." I put the order in and asked if he wanted fries or condiments. He said no, and I gave him his table number. As he walked away, I noticed 2 lumps under his jacket, like when a kid tucks his arm inside his shirt to stay warm. I watched him take 1 bite, put the burger down, and he made eye contact with me. Quickly, I looked away, but I could feel his stare for the next half hour. When I finally glanced over at him again, he was no longer there. But the burger stayed, sitting there half-eaten. The bite marks were jagged and uneven, like two mouths had torn into it at once. And the air smelled weird all of a sudden, like rust or blood. The guy came again the next day. Same time, same order, with that voice that sounded too dry to belong to a living man. But he was alive, pretty sure. I mean, he was breathing heavily through his nose, skin glistening like he was sweating. His jacket looked tighter that day, stretched around the shoulders. When he reached for the burger, the sleeve shifted. I saw movement underneath suddenly, something sliding like muscles fighting for space. "Do you work every morning?" he asked. His voice scraped like sandpaper but stayed calm. "Yeah," I said, trying to smile, "except Sundays." He nodded. When he picked up his burger, his sleeve shifted again, and I swear I saw another hand, holding the table steady as the other two ate. I dropped the rag I was holding. When he looked up, the extra hand was gone. He left half an hour later. When I cautiously went over to clean, the chair legs were bent backwards, like something heavy had been pressing down rather than just sitting in it. That night I dreamt about him standing behind the counter, ordering again, but this time when I handed him his food, the bag split open. Inside was raw meat, and the meat moved. What a horrible dream. On February 3rd, I came in early, hoping maybe I'd imagined all of it. But when I walked into the kitchen, the back freezer door was standing there wide open, and there were deep scratches on it, long and curved. I reported it, but I never got word about what the security footage showed, so I guess it didn't show anything of importance. Anyway, that's later on. Anyway, that day, he showed up at 5:30. This time, his coat was gone. This is going to sound insane, but trust me, because this is what I saw. The man had 4 arms, 2 normal ones, human ones. The other 2 were longer and thinner, almost insect-like, pale and veiny with twitching hands that never stood still. He wasn't trying to hide them anymore. I was wondering, was this some sort of mutation or deformity? He walked up to the counter, every step making a faint clicking noise. His upper hands rested on the counter, the lower ones dangling, twitching. "Same order?" I managed to ask. He smiled, teeth yellow and sharp. "You remember." When I handed him the bag, one of his lower arms brushed mine. The skin was cold and so dry, like the back of a long-dead lizard. He walked to the same table and tore the burger apart, not eating, just shredding it into tiny pieces. I hid in the back until my manager arrived. When we checked the lobby, the man was gone. All that remained was a mess of paper wrappers and handprints, 4 distinct handprints, pressed deep into the plastic tabletop. The next day I went in hoping he wouldn't show up. That day was my birthday. I was turning 19, so I went in praying he wouldn't show. But he did come. He wasn't walking this time. The man was crawling on all 4s, wearing shorts in 35-degree weather. He reached up, opened the door, and crawled inside. "Hello," he said cheerfully, like greeting a friend at a party. I froze, then ran. I bolted through the back door, jumped into my car, locked it, and floored it out of the lot. My gas light had been on since before work, but I didn't care. I had to get away. When I glanced in the mirror, my heart stopped. He was crawling after me, too fast. His limbs slammed against the pavement, propelling him forward in jerky insect-like bursts. I pushed the car to 60, then 70, but somehow he was still closing the distance. I kept driving until the engine sputtered and died, and the needle hit empty. I coasted to a stop near a patch of woods, heart and lungs on fire. There was a house up ahead, lights still on. I stumbled to the porch and pounded on the door. A woman in a nightgown answered instantly. Her face and voice were so calm and soft. I told her everything, every horrible detail. But she didn't seem to react much. She said I sounded exhausted, and she told me to come in. I sat down, tried to catch my breath. But somehow, for some reason, I ended up falling asleep right there. When I came to, the woman was standing over me, shaking my shoulder gently. I smiled until I saw her face. Her smile was wrong, too wide, and her limbs were longer than before, and she had 4 arms. I shoved her away from me and ran again. I sprinted down the road until my legs went numb. The sky was still gray, the sun low. I did not see her chasing me, but I could hear her, a dry clicking sound echoing between the trees. My car was dead, so I kept running. After a while, I found a small guns and ammo store. The lights were off, but the door was open, thank God. I slipped inside, hiding behind the counter. It smelled like grease and dust. I broke a glass case. I knew how to handle a gun, how to load it. So I grabbed a 9mm, and I watched the window. At first, nothing. Then movement. From the woods, a man crawled into view. No, something like a man, but with too many limbs. His head twisted too far to one side. He smiled at me, and I fired. It scurried away, leaving behind an orange-tinted trail. When the cops arrived, I was in quite a bit of trouble, obviously. But when I tried to tell them about the animal, pointing out the bloodstains on the street, they didn't seem to care, saying it was some animal. But it wasn't that. It wasn't human either. It was something else entirely. I don't know what it is about this week and the stories I've been reading. A lot of folks were asking for more short stories like the good old days, so I did that this week for Tales from the Break Room and Unexplained Encounters. But here I am reading submissions for obvious creepypasta, labeled as true stories, and believable, cool stories of the unexplained, all mixed together. Look, I like creepypasta as much as the next guy, but I miss reading about people seeing Bigfoot and Dogman in the woods. So if you've got any stories like that, send them to me at darkstories.org. Thank you. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sometimes being American is so boring, what with my gold hockey medal and 1,200-calorie breakfasts. So I'm happy to say that I have a fun episode for you today that immerses us in a story straight from Scotland. A story about a man working to feed his family, but must endure the most hellish road in the world. This story, from One with the Contour, is titled The Drove Road. This is a tale from the Break Room. And you can find Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Follow us and leave us a rating if you like us. Thank you. My father was a livestock haulier in the Scottish Highlands for 31 years. He moved sheep and cattle between farms and markets across some of the most remote country in Britain, driving roads that don't appear on most maps, in weather that would keep sensible people indoors. In all that time, he only ever refused one route. If a contract required the B road between Kinlochmore and Cannock, he passed it to another driver and took the financial hit. And if you asked him why, he would change the subject so fast, you'd find yourself talking about football or the price of diesel before you realized what happened. He did this for 3 decades, and in those 3 decades, he explained himself exactly once. On the second to last night of his life, no less, in a hospital room in Inverness, in the winter of 2004. 30 years of Richmond Super Kings had turned his lungs into something that could barely process air, and the man in that bed was so far from the man I grew up with that I had to remind myself more than once that they were the same person. He'd lost 4 stone. His skin had gone the color of dishwater. He breathed through a mask that fogged over with each exhale and cleared just enough between breaths to show his mouth moving underneath. And most of what he said in those final days was fragmented, drifting, half dissolved by morphine and exhaustion. But on that second to last night, when I was sitting beside his bed during a late visit because my mum had gone home to sleep and someone needed to be there, he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with perfect clarity, saying, "Close the door." I closed it. He said to me, "Sit down." And so I sat. He then told me about the Drove Road, and he told it from beginning to end in a level and steady voice. But his eyes stayed fixated on the ceiling the entire time, like he was reading the story off the tiles. He talked for about an hour. When he was done, he closed his eyes for some time. I sat there, wordless, because there was nothing adequate to reply with. He died the following morning at 6:30. I was in the corridor getting coffee from the machine when it happened. That became one of those details that really shouldn't matter, but now I can't stop thinking about. Why was I grabbing coffee? Did it really matter? I've never repeated what he told me that night, but I am going to now. I'm 57 years old now, and this story deserves to be told. Also, as a note before I begin, I've changed all instances of kilometers to miles. I've spent most of my life in America at this point, and I know most people reading this will likely be American too. My father, Alistair, grew up in a village near Bewley, about 12 miles west of Inverness. He left school at 15. School wasn't producing results for anyone involved, and he got work on farms around the Glen, which in the Highlands in the late 1950s was less a career choice than a gravitational inevitability. He was good with animals, and good with engines too, but not particularly good with people, which is a combination that either makes you a mechanic or a haulier. When he got his HGV license at 20, he found that driving a loaded truck through empty landscape for hours at a stretch suited him quite well. He bought a second-hand Bedford TK from a dealer in Dingwall, and a livestock trailer from a farmer in Muir of Ord who was getting out of sheep. And by his mid-20s, he was making a decent living moving animals around the north of Scotland. Livestock haulage is unglamorous work, and I won't dwell on it long, but you need to understand a few things to follow what happened. A haulier's reputation depends on delivering animals in the same condition he collected them. Stressed sheep lose weight, panicked sheep trample each other. A bruise on a ewe's flank or a limp that wasn't there at loading is a mark against the driver, and enough marks mean farmers stop calling. My father was careful. He checked his trailer before every job. The floor, the walls, partition gates, bolts and hinges and welds. You see, a loose fitting or a sharp edge in a livestock trailer is a liability, and because he took a workman's pride in doing the job properly, he checked it thoroughly. I say this to you so you understand that when animals came off his trailer injured, he knew it wasn't the trailer. In the autumn of 1972, my father had said late October or early November, but he wasn't certain on the exact date. But he picked up a contract from a farmer named Drummond. Drummond ran a hill farm in a remote glen west of Cannock, which itself is a remote place, and he needed 60-odd blackface ewes moved to a lowland farm near Bewley for winter grazing. The distance was about 30 miles of road, but the route mattered more than the distance, because the most direct way between the 2 points involved a 12-mile stretch of single-track B road that crossed open moorland between the 2 glens. This road followed the line of what was locally called the Drove Road. Drove roads are old routes, some of them medieval, which were used for centuries to walk livestock to market. Scotland is full of them. Most have been paved over or absorbed into the modern road network, and you would never know you were driving on one unless someone told you. This one, though, was different, at least according to my father, because the locals still called it by a Gaelic name that he said translated to something like the Road of the Carried Dead. It had been a corpse road before it was a drove road, the path along which the dead were carried from the remote communities in the western glens to consecrated ground in the east. My father mentioned this as a background detail, but I could hear something underneath the words even through the morphine and the steady tone, something that suggested he wished he'd paid more attention to it at the time. He had driven the road before without incident, though he noted, and I remember him pausing here briefly as if catching himself, that he had always driven it during daylight. The Drummond contract was different because of the logistics. Drummond's farm was at the end of a 5-mile track that was more suggestion than road, and the loading process with hill sheep is slow. Because the animals are half wild, they don't share the lowland sheep's resignation about being pushed into a trailer. By the time Alistair got the first batch loaded and cleared the farm track and reached the B road, the light would be gone. November in the Scottish Highlands means the sun sets at 4:30, and 4:30 comes faster than you expect when you're wrestling blackface ewes up a ramp. I should describe the road here. It's a single-track tarmac with passing places, no markings, no cat's eyes, no lighting. It crosses open moorland, flat peat bog stretching away on both sides, treeless, featureless, with low hills on the horizon that are more felt than seen after dark. The road sits slightly raised above the bog, like a causeway, which means that in wet weather, the standing water on either side reflects your headlights back at you, and it can feel like driving across a black lake on a narrow bridge. In daylight, it's bleak but manageable. After dark, with nothing ahead of you but the reach of your headlamps and nothing behind but whatever you've already passed, it becomes something else. My father described it as driving through the inside of a closed eye. The first trip was in late October. He loaded 20-odd ewes at Drummond's place in the late afternoon. Drummond was there to help. My father described him as the kind of older Highland farmer who communicates primarily through hand gestures and monosyllabic instructions, delivered at a volume meant for someone standing 50 yards away on a hillside. They got the sheep loaded, Drummond closed the trailer gate and bolted it. Then my father pulled out. He made it to the moor road at dusk. The last of the daylight was a thin orange band on the western horizon, and the road ahead was already dark enough to need headlights. The sheep in the trailer were settled, which was what you wanted. The ramp and the loading are the stressful parts, and once they're in and moving, they usually calm down. He drove the 12-mile stretch at a steady 40, which is about as fast as you'd want to push a loaded livestock trailer on a single track. About halfway across, he noticed the time. The 12 miles at 40 should take roughly 18 minutes, and he'd been driving for what felt like about that long, but the cattle grid at the far end of the moor, the landmark that meant you were off the open ground and dropping into the next glen, had not yet appeared. He checked his watch. 25 minutes. He wasn't worried yet, just mildly confused. He thought perhaps he had misjudged his start time. Or maybe he had gone slower than he'd thought. Maybe both. So he kept driving. The cattle grid appeared after 47 minutes on this 12-mile road. My father was not a man who made errors about things like speed and distance. He had been driving professionally for the better part of a decade by then, and he could estimate his speed within a mile or two per hour without looking at the dial. He knew how long 12 miles took at 40. It didn't take 47 minutes. He shrugged it off as something odd and carried on to the destination farm. Because practical men like him, well, they archive things away, and they carry on. After all, there's no useful response to a road being longer than it should be. He unloaded at the receiving farm near Bewley. The farmer was a man called Geddes, and Geddes was waiting with the gate open and a torch in his hand, as it was past 7 by then and fully dark. They dropped the ramp and the sheep came out. The first 17 or 18 were fine. They trotted down the ramp and into the pen, in that stop-start uncertain way, like animals do when they're adjusting to solid ground after a moving floor. The last two, however, were limping. Both ewes, both favoring their front left leg, both with the same stiff, pained reluctance to put weight on it. And behind them, the last animal out, a ewe with a gash along her right flank that ran from just behind the shoulder almost to the hip. It was deep, deep enough that the flesh had parted, and you could see the pink of the muscle underneath. It was clean, almost surgically straight, as if it had been made with a blade, and not by an animal catching itself on some protruding edge. Geddes looked at the injuries, then at my father. My father said it wasn't quite an accusatory look he gave him, but certainly something that wanted explanation. Yet my father didn't have one. He had checked the trailer before loading, as he always did, and there was nothing in it that could produce a wound like that. Geddes cleaned the gash with iodine and wrapped it, and they agreed that the ewes must have knocked into each other during transit, which can happen when animals panic and scramble. Except these sheep had never panicked, not during the ride. They had been calm the entire way. My father had listened to the sounds of distress before. Stamping, bleating, the thud of bodies hitting the trailer walls, and had heard nothing on this trip. He drove home to Bewley and told my mother the delivery had gone fine. I mean, in the accounting of his mind, it had. Sheep sometimes arrive with injuries. Sometimes they have injuries as they load and you miss it. It was an imperfect business. He went to bed, he slept, and if he dreamed about anything, he didn't remember it in the morning. The second trip was 4 days later. The same route and the same time of day. Same conditions. An afternoon loading and a dusk departure that put him on the moor road after dark. This time he watched his clock from the moment his tires hit the single track. He drove at a careful, consistent 40, and he did not speed up or slow down, and he counted the minutes. The 12-mile crossing took 44 minutes, which at 40 miles per hour is a distance of just over 29 miles. The road was 12 miles long. He had just driven 29. He said nothing about this to anyone. It didn't make sense. He didn't want to dwell on it. Perhaps there was an error. If it was an error, it was not in his equipment, though. It had to be on the road. Perhaps the signs, perhaps something. He didn't know. At the Geddes farm, they unloaded. 3 ewes were injured this time, all with the same clean lacerations on the left side of the body, like something in the trailer was making a single cut across each animal at the same height and from the same direction. And there was one more, too. She was standing at the back of the trailer, facing the wall when they opened the gate. She didn't move when the others filed out, and when Geddes climbed in, coaxing her to turn around, he stepped back and said something under his breath in Gaelic that my father didn't catch. The poor thing's left eye was gone. The socket was open and empty and clean, like the eye had been lifted out by a surgeon, not torn or burst, and there was almost no blood. Maybe some thin, dry residue on the wool below the socket, but that's it. The ewe stood there and looked at them with her remaining eye, and she was calm. Entirely, horribly calm. My father wondered if it was adrenaline caused by the pain and fear. He and Geddes stood in the yard with a torch beam on that empty socket, and they didn't talk as they observed. Eventually, Geddes said it must have been a bolt, maybe a rough edge in the trailer, something the ewe had pressed her face against. My father knew every surface in that trailer down to the inch, and there was nothing that could do what had been done. He and Geddes both knew this, but neither of them said so out loud, and that knowing set between them like a stone. He drove home. He checked the trailer in the morning with a torch, running his hands over every surface, every join, and every bolt head. But he didn't find anything out of place. The interior walls were smooth, galvanized steel. The floor was clean. He couldn't even find blood anywhere, which itself was messed up. A wound like that eye, especially, should have left blood on the floor, on the walls, or somewhere. The trailer was as clean as the day he had loaded it. That night he dreamed he was walking the moor road in the dark, on foot, alone. There was something behind him matching his pace step for step, with a half-second delay, so that each of his footfalls produced an echo that was not quite an echo. as it came from the wrong direction. He walked for hours, and the road did not end. He woke up in his bed with his heart going a mile a minute, and my mom asleep beside him. He told himself it was a dream. Then he went downstairs and found his work boots by the front door, with black peat mud on the soles. He stood there in the kitchen in the early light and looked at those boots. You see, he did not own peat land, and he had not gone outside as far as he could remember. My father nearly refused the third run. He phoned Drummond and said he was busy, which was a lie. November was slow, and he had no other contracts that week. Drummond offered more money, and my father said it wasn't the money. Drummond then cleared his throat and asked, "Your wife's expecting, isn't she?" And my father said yes. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me at the time, a detail I've never been able to sit comfortably with. Drummond then explained how he needed the work, and so offered him double the rate. My father said no, so Drummond said something else. My father repeated it to me in the hospital, exactly as he remembered it, and I'll do that for you as well. Drummond had said, "You've been across 3 times now, Alistair. Twice there, once back empty. That's 3 crossings of a road that wants 4. You think it matters whether you're driving it? You walked it last night in your sleep. It'll have you walking it every night until you finish what you started, or until it finishes for you." My father asked how Drummond knew about the walking, but he didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Finish the contract. 4 loaded crossings, that's a full drove. That's what the road wants. Leave it at 3, and that there's unfinished business. And that road has been collecting unfinished business since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." My father took the job. I don't know why. He didn't explain his reasoning to me, and I've spent 2 decades considering the possibilities, and I still can't settle on one. The money was part of it. We were not well off, and a baby was coming. Double rate for a day's work was not something he could dismiss easily. But obviously it was more than that. I think Drummond's mention of the sleepwalking frightened him in such a way. It confirmed that what was happening was not contained to the road. It was following him home. The peat on his boots, the dreams, the road reaching into his house while he slept. If Drummond was right, then driving the road again was not adding to the danger. The danger was already present, accumulating, and the only way to discharge it was to complete the crossing, give the road what it wanted. He loaded the 3rd batch at Drummond's farm on a gray afternoon in the 2nd week of November. The sky was low and flat. The highland was overcast, making it impossible to tell where the sun was or how much light you had left. And the darkness, when it came, arrived without a transitional period. 1 minute, the moor was visible in washed-out gray, and the next, the headlights were cutting tunnels through solid black. He was on the moor road by 4:45. At mile 6, confirmed by his odometer, which he was now checking obsessively, he saw the figure. It was on the road ahead of him, walking the left-hand edge in the same direction he was traveling. His headlights picked it up at about 100 yards. The outline of a person, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, hunched forward under the weight of something draped across his shoulders. The posture was that of a man carrying a heavy load, bent at the waist, arms raised to grip whatever was slung behind his neck. My father's first thought was that it was a stalker, not what you'd think when you hear the word stalker, but rather a deer hunter coming off the hill with a carcass. You carry a deer across your shoulders with the legs hanging down your chest, and from behind in poor light, that's approximately what this looked like. He slowed the truck. The road was single track and there was no room to pass without the figure stepping aside, so he dropped to walking pace and flashed his headlights. The figure, though, did not react. He tapped his horn, A short bleat that sounded enormous in the moorland silence, but no response. The figure kept walking at the same pace. My father rolled along behind it at 5 miles per hour, with his headlights fully on its back, and so more details began to resolve. The coat was long past the knees, and it was not a modern garment. My father said it looked heavy and shapeless, like rough wool or oilskin that you see in old photographs of agricultural workers from a century ago. The figure moved wrong too, stiff and repetitive, like the legs beneath the coat were operating on a mechanism, not through muscular intent. Each step was identical to the last in length and timing, no variation, no adjustment for the camber of the road or the rough surface. This was not like a living man's walk, constantly adapting to the ground beneath them. This was a walk that had been fixed and placed, and was simply repeating. The thing across its shoulders was no deer. The legs hanging down the figure's chest. My father could see them clearly now in the headlights, swaying with each step, were too thin and ended in small cloven hooves, and there were too many of them. He counted at least 4 distinct legs, possibly 6, layered over each other, which meant the figure was carrying more than one animal. Sheep. Dead sheep. Draped and stacked across its shoulders, and it was walking the drove road at 5 o'clock on a November night, as though this were a task it had been performing for a very long time, and intended to perform for a great deal longer. My father stopped the truck. He told me he didn't know why he did. Every functioning part of his brain was telling him to accelerate and get clear of this, but his foot went to the brake, and his hands went still. He sat in the idling cab with his headlights on the figure 20 yards ahead. He couldn't look away from it, and he couldn't move. He said it was like the road was holding him there, like he was trapped in some unseen current. Some unseen force had interposed itself and had told him to wait. The sheep in the trailer then started screaming. My father used that word specifically, and I'll use it here. He was a man who had spent his adult life around livestock. He knew the full range of sounds they make, and what came out of that trailer was not bleating and was not distress calls. It was a sound he had never heard from sheep before, and he said it was the sound of animals who knew, in whatever limited way that sheep could know anything, that something was present that was fundamentally incompatible with their being alive. The sound broke whatever was holding him. He released the brake, put the truck in second, and floored the accelerator. The Bedford lurched past the figure on the narrow road, doing 50 on a surface that was barely safe at 30. As he passed, he looked to his left through the driver's side window, and the figure was there, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the glass hadn't been between them. He saw its face then. My father described this once. Back in that hospital bed with his eyes on the ceiling, his voice perfectly steady, and his free hand gripping the bed rail so hard that the tendons rose up through the skin like cables. When he was done describing it, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for a full minute. I sat there and listened to his breathing apparatus cycle, and I didn't say a word. The face had been a man's face. My father was certain of this. The underlying structure was human, the proportions were human. The basic architecture of brow and cheekbone and jaw was that of a grown man. But the flesh over that structure had been transformed in a way that my father could only compare to the photographs he'd seen of bog bodies pulled from peat. The skin darkened to a deep reddish brown, compressed tight against the skull, shrunk and hardened by acid and time until it was less skin than leather. The lips drawn back from the teeth in a permanent, involuntary grimace, the sockets deep and shadowed. Peat preserved, tanned by centuries in the ground. The ground tans everything it keeps long enough. The eyes in those sockets were open. They were wet and they moved. They tracked the truck as it passed, and my father said that in the half second he saw them, he understood that the face was dead, but that the eyes were not. That contradiction was the worst part. Something was looking out of that face that had no business being behind dead eyes, and it saw him clearly. And yet it was not surprised to see him there. He drove the remaining 6 miles without slowing down. His odometer recorded the distance as 9. He was past questioning this by then. At the Geddes farm, they opened the trailer. 14 of the 15 sheep walked out in good order. The 15th was at the back of the trailer, at the far corner, and it wasn't standing up. Now I must describe what my father described to me, and I'll do it plainly, though it is bizarre and disturbing. The ewe was on its side. It was definitely alive. My father could see its ribcage moving, shallow but rapid breathing. Its eyes were open, and its legs were making small rhythmic paddling motions, like a dying animal's legs moving as the nervous system fails. But the animal's not dying from any wound or impact. Well, nothing that made sense anyway. You see, its abdomen had been opened up. The skin and wool of the belly had been parted along a line so clean and straight, it looked measured, from the sternum to the pelvis, and the 2 flaps of skin had been folded back, laid flat against the ground on either side of the body, like the pages of some book. The interior of the animal was exposed. Organs, musculature, the architecture of a living sheep presented in cross-section, as though for a veterinary demonstration. The organs had been rearranged. The stomach and intestines, which should have been in the abdominal cavity, had been drawn out and placed on the exterior of the body in positions that corresponded roughly to where they would sit if the animal's inside and outside had been reversed. The liver was where the wool should have been. The wool was underneath. Everything was in the wrong place but arranged with intent. Something with horrible creativity had opened this animal up and tried to put it back together according to a different set of instructions. Somehow, the ewe was breathing through all of this. Its legs were still paddling. Its eye, the one my father could see, was open and looking at nothing. My father and Geddes stood at the back of that trailer in the dark farmyard with a single torch beam on the poor animal, and neither of them said a word. My father said they stood there for minutes, which feels like years when you're standing in silence looking at something impossible. Geddes then climbed into the trailer, cutting the ewe's throat with his penknife. The breathing stopped. The legs stopped. And that was that. They dragged the remains out of the trailer, burying them behind the farm buildings in the dark, working by torchlight. When the hole was filled and the ground stamped flat, Geddes stuck his spade in the earth, leaning on it, and said, "Don't bring any more animals down that damned road." My father explained that he still had one more trip. Geddes gave him a look and said, "My father used to haulage sheep before me, and his father before him. Nobody in my family drives after dark on the moor road, and I'd suggest you arrive at the same policy." He picked up his spade and walked away. My father drove home. He didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he first stayed in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of tea, sort of just listening to the house. He tried to find a way to make what he had seen fit into a normal world, but he failed to do so. The days after the third trip were the part of the story my father told with the least detail. I think this was not because nothing happened, but because what happened was personal. And even on his deathbed, there were things he didn't want to hand down to his son. He said he felt different, that food had lost its familiar taste. Even the reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed or lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, but he could feel it. And he had dreams every night. The moor road, footsteps behind him, the walk that didn't end, and every morning the boots were by the door with fresh peat on the soles. My mother noticed. She was not an easily frightened woman, but my father said she had begun watching him with a quality of attention associated with waiting rooms. Patient, alert, braced for any kind of news. One evening she told him he smelled different. He asked what she meant. She said she could not describe it, except that it wasn't him. The smell of his very skin had changed, and she looked afraid, likely because my father wasn't sick. And if he was, that would be treatable. This wasn't. Drummond eventually called. One more trip, the final batch. 15 ewes, finish the contract, finish the drove, and be done. My father said yes. Drummond's warning was the last thing my father heard before he pulled out of the farm track onto the B road for the final time. They'd loaded the 15 ewes in near silence, working quickly in the afternoon light, and as my father climbed into the cab, Drummond put his hand on the doorframe, and he held it there so that the door couldn't close. He looked my father dead in the eye, and he said, "Don't stop. Whatever you see on that road, don't stop the truck. If it stalls, you stay in the cab. Do not put your feet on that road after dark." My father asked what would happen if he did. Drummond took his hand off the doorframe and said, "Then you'll join the drove." He stepped back, and my father closed the door. That was the last time the two men spoke. It was 3:30 when he reached the B road. Sunset was at 4:30. 12 miles at 45 would take 16 minutes. He would be off the moor and through the cattle grid with daylight to spare. My father said he felt something close to optimism as he turned onto the single track, which tells you how far his calibration had shifted over the preceding weeks. That the prospect of driving a road that had mutilated livestock and put living eyes in a dead man's face could produce anything resembling relief. But he had daylight, and he had speed, and he had an engine that had never let him down. In 16 minutes, it should be over. The moor opened up on either side as the road climbed away from the glen. Brown peat, gray sky, hills on the horizon just visible through a thin haze. He set his speed at 45 and watched the odometer and drove. At mile 3, the sky changed. The overcast, which had been a uniform gray sheet all day, thickened and dropped. This man had driven through highland squalls and hill fog, even through horizontal rain so bad it reduced visibility to the length of the bonnet. But this was strange. The light simply left. No fade whatsoever. The light was simply removed. He checked his watch. 3:50. The sunset should not have been for another 40 minutes. The dark had come early, and it came all at once. There was nothing natural about this. He pressed his accelerator. The engine responded, but the truck felt heavy suddenly, sluggish, laboring, like it was having trouble pulling the additional weight of the trailer now. The temperature gauge, which normally sat comfortably in the middle third of its range, began to climb. He was doing 45 by the speedometer, but the sensation of speed was wrong too. The road ahead unspooled in his headlights at a pace that felt closer to 30. Mile 6, the halfway point on a 12-mile road, except by now he had no faith that that road was 12 miles. He drove and he watched the odometer count, and he kept his hands tight on the wheel. The sheep in the trailer stayed silent. He had been listening for them since the start of the drive, but he'd heard nothing. Over a dozen animals standing in a metal box in a moving vehicle eventually produced some sound, but these were producing nothing. It had been so completely quiet behind him that if he hadn't loaded them himself an hour earlier, he could have believed that the trailer was empty. Mile 9. No cattle grid. The moor road continued ahead of him, straight and featureless. the headlights reaching maybe 80 yards before the dark swallowed them. The temperature gauge was nudging the red. The engine note had changed from the steady diesel thrum that he knew as well as his heartbeat to something strained and arrhythmic, a machine working against a resistance which it was not designed for. He checked the wing mirror on the driver's side. A habit of his. A haulier does this every few minutes without thinking about it. There, in the red wash of the taillights, at the furthest edge of what the glow could reach, there were shapes on the road behind him. They were low and pale, moving in a loose formation that spread across the width of the road and the verges on either side. Sheep. There were sheep on the road behind his trailer, following him across the moor, and there were far more of them than the 15 he was carrying. He could see dozens. They filled the road from edge to edge and extended back beyond the reach of his taillights into a darkness that could have contained any number more. They were walking at the same pace as his truck, keeping a steady distance, and even in the dim red light and the small shaking rectangle of the wing mirror, he could see that they were not normal. Like that figure from before, they moved stiffly and uniformly, every animal moving in the same rhythm, legs working in lockstep that normal sheep would never do. Some of them were even walking on legs that were bent oddly, which would make it impossible for a living animal to stand on, let alone move with. One near the front of the flock, where the tail light was strongest, had its head hanging sideways from a clearly broken neck. The skull was resting against its own shoulder, and it walked the same steady pace as the rest. Their wool was dark and matted, with something that looked like mud but wasn't, and the ones closest to the light had a quality to their bodies that my father struggled to articulate that I will try to convey as precisely as I can. They looked compressed, flattened, as though they had been subject to enormous pressure that had pushed them into a denser version of themselves, the way peat pushes everything into a tighter, darker, more preserved form. My father faced forward and put his foot down. The engine screamed, the speedometer read 50, but that road was not meant for 50. The truck shuddered and swayed, and he held the wheel with both hands, determined to keep driving, due to what Drummond had told him, and because looking in that mirror again was something that he could not bring himself to do. Mile 14. There was no cattle grid still. The road should have ended 2 miles ago by any honest measurement, and it had not ended. The engine temperature was in the red, and the needle was still climbing. My father could smell hot metal and coolant, and he knew that the truck was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. It died at mile 15. Like a dying man's pulse, the engine stopped, mid-beat, total, without the courtesy of a gradual failure. The truck rolled forward on its remaining momentum, slowing, and came to a rest on the empty road, with the headlights dimming to amber on battery power, and the dark closing in from every direction, like water filling a hole. He sat in the cab. He did not try the ignition. He knew the engine was gone, and he understood that turning the key would drain the battery faster, and the headlights were the only thing between him and absolute darkness. He wanted them for as long as they would last. The cab was cooling rapidly. The heater had died with the engine, and the November cold came in through the glass and the floor and the doors. Yet underneath that cold was the other cold, the one he'd felt on the moor road from the first trip. Wet and organic, carrying the smell of deep peat, the smell of ground full of dead things. In the wing mirror, the flock had stopped. They stood on the road behind the trailer in a dense, still mass, and in the fading taillight, they almost looked like ordinary sheep if you kept your focus soft and did not look too closely. My father did not examine them closely either. He glanced once, then he faced forward, placing his hands on the wheel as he waited, The flock parted. He heard that part rather than saw it. The sound of hooves on tarmac shifting to either side, pressing to the verges to open a path through their center. And through that center, at a pace that matched the mechanical rhythm of the flock's walking, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy steps, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound underneath, as though this new figure was leaving a trail on the road surface. The footsteps passed along the left side of the trailer, close enough that my father could hear the brush of the long coat against the metal sidewall. And then they were alongside the truck. Then they were alongside the cab, and then they stopped outside the driver's door. My father didn't look. He stared through the windshield at the last pale cone of his failing headlights on the empty road ahead. He kept his hands on the wheel, and he didn't turn his head. He could hear it, though. Hear it standing there inches from the glass, the sound of its breathing thin and papery. Beneath the breathing, he could hear other smaller sounds. The faint creak of the weight across its shoulders shifting, the slow drip of something landing on the tarmac below, the soft, wet contact of the dead sheep's hooves swaying against the figure's chest. And it stood there for so long. But my father didn't count. He said that time lost its structure, because when you're in a situation like that, time loses its meaning. The only way he knew time was truly passing was the fact that the headlights were still getting dimmer, and that the cold was getting deeper. He gripped the wheel, and he did not look at it. He did not speak to it. He refused to move. Suddenly, the glass made a sound, a high and thin sound, like something hard being drawn down a smooth surface. My father kept his eyes forward, but he could see it in his peripheral vision. The movement on the driver's side window, the dark shape at the glass. The sound continued, a slow downward stroke, from the top of the window to the bottom. Then another, parallel to the first, and another. 4 strokes altogether, 4 lines or grooves being inscribed into the exterior of the glass by something that was not a fingernail, and was not a tool, and was, as far as my father's peripheral vision could tell, the tip of a bare, dark, and hardened finger. The sound stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, but then the footsteps resumed, moving past the cab, past the bonnet, and now onto the road ahead. The dragging sound went with it, and the flock on the verges began to move, falling in line behind the figure. The whole procession, the shepherd and his dead drove, walked north along the moor road until the sound of their passage faded and the night was silent. My father was alone. He waited, maybe 5 minutes. He could not have waited longer because his body was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to keep his hands on the wheel, and the cold had gotten into him, touching his very core. He turned the key, and the engine started right away, turning over on the first attempt with a healthy, steady note. It was like the dang thing had never stopped. The headlights brightened, the temperature gauge sat in the middle of its range, and the cab began to warm up. He put the truck in gear and drove. The cattle grid appeared less than 2 miles later, exactly where the map said it should be, and he crossed it, and the road dropped into the glen, and the moor was behind him. He did not look back. At the Geddes farm, the farmer had agreed to receive this final batch despite what he'd said before. My father never explained how that arrangement had been made. They opened the trailer. 14 sheep came out, healthy, uninjured, and calm. 14, not 15. The trailer was sealed, bolted from the outside. There was no gap or breach anywhere in its construction, nowhere for a 60-kilogram animal to leave through. 14 sheep walked into the pen, and the 15th simply did not exist. There was no body, no blood, no wool and no hoofprint. There was no indication that a 15th animal had ever been in the trailer at all. Geddes counted twice, so did my father. 14. Geddes looked at my father across the pin gate, and my father looked back. Geddes took out his delivery book, signed the receipt for 15, and put the book away. He closed the pin and walked toward his house without turning around. My father drove home to Bewley in the dark with the heater on full and the radio playing. His hands were steady on the wheel and his mind was blank. He parked outside his house and sat in the cab for a while before finally going inside. He didn't check the trailer. He never checked that trailer again. He never drove that moor road again either. The contract was finished. Drummond never called, and my father never inquired. He learned years later and secondhand that Drummond had been found dead on the moor road in the spring of 1979. They found him sitting upright against a fence post with his crook across his lap, dead of exposure on a night when the temperature had not dropped below 7 degrees. The man who told my father about this said Drummond looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, though the pathologist's report put the death at only a few hours before the body was found. My father received this information, said nothing, and changed the subject. Those changes my father dealt with, well, they faded. The dreams stopped within a month or so. The peat mud stopped appearing on his boots. The strange thing about his reflection even settled. My mother stopped watching him, and the smell she had noticed went away. By the time I was born in February of 1973, my father was, by all external measures, the same man he'd been before the contract. He went back to work. He hauled livestock for another 28 years, and he never spoke about what happened, never drove that road. But he was a different man. But because I grew up inside that difference, I wasn't able to name it myself. But I knew that he flinched at dead animals on the roadside. Not the typical grimace that you might make, but a full-body recoil, a jerk of the head away, as though the sight was physically painful. He wouldn't walk on unpaved ground after dark, which in the rural highlands is a significant constraint, and if circumstances forced it, he moved with a rigid, mechanical haste that I now recognize as a man trying to spend as little time as possible with his feet on open earth. He kept the radio on every waking hour in every room he occupied, a low and continuous murmur of voices and music that didn't really serve an entertainment purpose. He really didn't listen to it himself. It was just sound to fill the quiet, made him feel less alone. A few years after he died, I flew out to visit my mom, and I went to look at the truck. The Bedford was still in the barn where he'd parked it after his last job, covered in dust and pigeon droppings, but structurally intact. I opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. I mean, my father had spent more hours in that seat than in any chair in our house. There was something of him still in the worn vinyl, and the position of the mirrors, and the faint smell of diesel and livestock. I looked at the driver's side window. The scratches were still there. 4 vertical lines scored into the exterior surface, running from the top to the bottom, deep enough to catch a fingernail when I ran my hand across them on the outside. These weren't cracks. They weren't random marks of road debris or scraped branches. They were a warning, and they were proof that my dad's story was more true than I liked to believe. I feel like roads can be haunted like houses can be haunted, but one seems far worse. If you're trapped in a haunted house, you cover your head, you ignore the ghosts, and you wait for dawn. But a haunted road, well, you're at the mercy of the infinite darkness, my friend, and whatever lurks within it. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit. You can also find this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the YouTube channel, Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.